Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Today we're going to be starting a new series where we teach you how to protect your family and home from dolphins. Just joking, although that is on the idea list, hashtag humanity first. No, instead today we're going to be starting a new series called 10 Flaws. We'll be looking at a variety of different things from the Star Wars galaxy, from droids to ships to maybe even governmental systems. Who knows? Just make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification button so you can see where this series will take us, because not even I know where this series will take us. Starting off the series is perhaps one of the most flawed droid designs in the history of Star Wars, the B-1 battle droid. The B-1 battle droids were inspired by security droids used on Trade Federation vessels during the pre-Clone War era. When the Clone Wars erupted, these security droids were quickly redesigned and rushed onto the battlefield. Deployed in massive numbers on open ground against similarly positioned enemies, the B-1 battle droids were quite formidable. They could overwhelm positions en masse and posed a significant threat. But as individual soldiers, the B-1 battle droid was just terrible. Now, we here at Generation Tech do understand that the B-1 battle droid was designed to be a budget-level security droid, which was mainly used for cannon fodder, but I still can't really get over some of the design choices that the Separatist Alliance made with them. We're not really sure what kind of metal was used on the B-1 battle droid, but according to reports, this metal is incapable of stopping blaster bolts and lightsabers. On top of that, the material was extremely heavy. It was reported that clone troopers who ran out of restraints for prisoners during battles would just lay B-1 battle droids that were deactivated on top of prisoners. So what we have here is a battle droid made most likely of some kind of low-quality durasteel, which is extremely heavy. Then we had underpowered servos and motors for the robot joints, making it awkward, slow, and unbalanced. A good alternative to using a heavy metal would have been a lighter polymer like Duraplast or Plastoids. These materials were lighter. The entire Phase 1 clone trooper armor was said to have weighed only 40 kilos. With a lighter and more protective armor shell that isn't that much more expensive than heavy metals, you have a more mobile and deadlier soldier. And these are the type of advantages that droids should have over organics anyway. It's said that the B-1 battle droids were designed as bipedal robots so that they can be quickly integrated into Separatist vehicles, which were designed for similarly limbed organics. But this again seems like a terrible design choice. The Separatist droid army was completely made up of droids. They didn't share their vehicles or weapons with organic counterparts. So refitting their vehicles to a more properly designed battle droid seems like a better option in this case. By designing their weapons and vehicles for bipeds, they make it easier for clone troopers to steal and operate Separatist vehicles and weapons. The bipedal design also made the droids a lot more awkward. Locomotion with only 2 legs is actually quite a difficult task. Humans have a large brain that makes this possible, but actually replicating that in a machine, especially one as cheaply built as the B-1, is a major feat. That's why here on Earth, most robot combat platforms are designed on treads or at least 4 legs. What makes a bipedal robot more difficult to design is its higher center of gravity. This makes the platform less stable, and that's not really ideal when you're designing a battle droid which is supposed to encounter all different types of terrains. On top of that, the B-1 battle droid had long, narrow limbs which were easy targets for lightsabers and blasters. Destroying any of these fragile limbs could severely hamper the combat efficiency of a unit. A longer, taller design also meant more surface area that needed to be covered by armor. Instead of putting all the vital systems in the chest of the droid, for some reason the computer was placed in the head module of the droid, which is located on an extremely thin neck strut. This obsession of replicating organic form in their droids doesn't end here though. In order to program movement into these unstable, underpowered, and overly heavy droids, the Separatists actually used motion capture technology of elite organic soldiers so that the battle droids could replicate these movements. If you really think about it, that makes no sense. Organic soldiers move the way they move because of the way their bodies were built and naturally limit them. Most organics have a lot of limitations, only 4 limbs and only 2 limbs that have enough dexterity to manipulate weapons and other complicated machines. Organics also have a certain power to weight ratio and limited flexibility. Organics also have organs that need to be in certain positions in order for tasks to be completed. For instance, when a soldier is shooting, they must also expose their head and eyes in order to find a target. A droid doesn't necessarily need to do that. They could just have a camera on their weapon, which is then attached to their computer brain. Now, this reverse engineering of organic movement is just another symptom of the terrible design of these B-1 battle droids. This is all because the Separatists wanted their droids to mimic organic beings for one reason or another. By now you probably see a trend in how these B-1 battle droids were being designed, but not only were they physically able to mimic organics, they also had the personality of organic beings. But instead of programming desirable traits for a combat droid like aggression or resilience, these droids seem to have been programmed with extremely unnecessary traits like fear. As a matter of fact, sometimes in bad situations, droids were known to throw their weapons to the ground and start screaming and running in circles.
Greetings. Oh my god!
Why the hell would you do that? Why would you design your droids to have fear, especially if they're involved in a battle? Perhaps it's the self-preservation motivator going haywire. Nonetheless, this isn't the only problematic personality quirk that these droids have. Other B-1s have displayed cowardice, laziness, and even arrogance against other droids, which makes them underestimate their enemy. The B-1 battle droids were also known for being extremely stupid and incapable on the battlefield. What separates the US military from the rest of the world? It's not necessarily our weapon systems or vehicles or even our training, it's the connectivity and networking that allows our troops to know exactly where everyone else is on the battlefield. This type of battlefield integration is like a second pair of eyes. It allows our troops to move the right material and personnel to the right places in the battlefield. It's a force multiplier and helps fight the dreaded fog of war. Now, naturally, humans don't have the capability to do this. We need to give them wireless transmitters and GPS chips. But droids, on the other hand, would be perfect for this kind of system. As a matter of fact, before the Clone Wars, the Trade Federation already had a system like this in place of their original OOM droids. Unfortunately, there was one glaring weakness. If someone destroyed the central command center, all the droids would deactivate, because they weren't able to function independently. The droids that the Separatists deployed could function by themselves, but for some reason they could only communicate with each other verbally. Now sure, in order to talk to organic commanders, it might be easier to be able to use verbal speech, but in the middle of the battlefield, wouldn't it be easier if the droids could communicate to each other wirelessly? This way, the enemy can't hear what they're saying. Also, then your communications are only limited by the range of your transmitters and receivers. Shouldn't all droids be a part of a network so that their commanders know exactly what the battlefield looks like? Each droid could have a camera or a sensor that fills in a part of the map. Think of it like a bird's eye view of an RTS game. But again, for some reason, no system like this existed as far as we know. That's why the Clone Army and Jedi Generals are able to sneak up on Separatist facilities and take droids out one at a time without notifying the entire base. This is a really strange design oversight. It's not even that expensive to implement a system like this. It's a complete design oversight by the Separatist Alliance. The whole Separatist droid army should be integrated. Imagine if the B-1s could communicate with vulture droids and direct air sorties or receive reconnaissance information from the sky. This would completely change the battlefield. If the B-1 battle droids were advanced enough to exhibit human-like emotions on the battlefield, why can't they have more tactical awareness? As a matter of fact, there were tactical B-1 commander units, and their hardware was no different from the average B-1 battle droid. So what it comes down to is a software program, and once you have your software programmed, it really doesn't cost that much to upload it into other computers. So why didn't the Separatist Alliance just give all of their droids commander-level tactical programming? Wouldn't that make them a much more competent fighting force? Instead, you have a bunch of extremely stupid units that are only able to overwhelm enemy positions when they have a numerical advantage. Motion tracking technology in cameras has been around since I was a little kid. You guys remember those LEGO Mindstorm cameras? In principle, they aren't all that different from the motion tracking software that's used today in security and military industries. The scary thing is this technology is already far superior to human vision and reaction times when it comes to acquiring targets and tracking motion. Of course, there's a problem with identifying what is a threat and what isn't. They're still working on that. But having said that, it does really confuse me why B-1 battle droids are so terrible at aiming their weapons. With proper calibration on their weapons and sensors, they really should never miss their targets. The computing brains in these droids are more than powerful enough to calculate trajectories in a split second. They shouldn't even be able to fire their weapons if they know they're not on target. During a battle like Geonosis where there was no cover, the clones should have been immediately wiped out. So I really gotta ask, what the hell are the Separatist Alliance putting inside of their droids that are handicapping their aiming so much? It's almost like they're doing it on purpose to help the clone troopers. Another relic of the organic soldier age is the detachable weapon. I understand the need to save in R&D costs by not designing a new firearm, but the potential increase in combat efficiency is definitely worth it, especially if you look at how many Separatist droids they designed. Millions. And it wouldn't even need to be all that complicated of a design. You could use pre-existing designs and just remove parts that are designed for organics. If you've ever fired a gun before, you know that one of the points of instability in a weapon is the trigger pull. When you're pulling a trigger, it's not a symmetrical movement because of the way our fingers are designed. It's almost a lateral movement. The handle of the gun and trigger are also below the bullet chamber and barrel, which again is not a symmetrical action. And at high velocities and long ranges, small little deviations at the trigger pull can severely change the trajectory of a bullet. But the reason why guns are designed the way they are is because they ergonomically fit humans better that way. Ideally, what you want when aiming a projectile is to position yourself symmetrically with the force of the weapon, which basically means right behind the firing chamber. One way to do it is just to cut your arm off and place the gun in place of your arm. Kind of like what a super battle droid does. This would significantly eliminate any kind of lateral movement, and I'm kind of confused why they didn't just do the same thing with the B-1 battle droids, cut their arms off and attach cannons to them. By giving them hands that are designed to manipulate a trigger, this actually makes their accuracy worse. It also allows enemy combatants to pick up their weapons and use them against them. The B-1 battle droids rifles also had energy packs in them, which meant they had to reload. It would have been a lot simpler for them to just design an energy pack into the droid, that way they could fire continuously, making them more efficient in combat. Again, this is a terrible design choice. One of the main thrown weapons used by clone troopers was something known as a droid popper or an EMP grenade. For one reason or another, B-1 battle droids, along with most droids in the Separatist army, were extremely susceptible to these types of weapons. I'm actually surprised that the Republic didn't take advantage of this more often. It wasn't until Milestar that we see the JR employ larger EMP weapons. But actually shielding something from an EMP is quite simple. Actually, we have many different techniques and methods here on Earth that actually work very well. Now, obviously, there are a lot of doomsayers out there that say that a solar flare or a nuclear EMP could destroy our civilization, and I guess they are technically right, but that's only because most consumer and infrastructure electronics aren't shielded from EMPs. But if you were an advanced society that just created a droid army and you know that your enemy has EMP weapons, wouldn't you at least provide some basic shielding on your droids? Here on Earth, a simple Faraday cage would work. Typically, they were made out of some kind of metal mesh that can block out EMP fields. Some everyday example of Faraday cages would be like a microwave or an elevator. These are devices that could easily be designed into the armor or framework of a battle droid. Battle droids run on energy, and unless that energy is some kind of dangerous fission reactor, they usually need to be recharged routinely. During this downtime, the droids are just as vulnerable as a soldier who needs sleep, which is why I would place some type of rechargeable solar panel on the droids to supplement their battery chargers. And not only is it good for the environment, it can also extend the killing time of a droid. It also serves as another reflective surface that could block or at least reflect a blaster bolt. In my opinion, the B-1 battle droid was most likely designed by a child who focused on aesthetics rather than function, but at the same time that child has terrible taste in what looks cool or not. The Star Destroyer, one of the most recognizable triangle-shaped things after pizza and Herbalife's business model. It inspires fear-induced battle movements into the hearts of the Empire's enemies. And its design is inspired by thousands of years of Sith genocides, raids, and pillaging. It's aggressive, it's powerful, and when you place 6 of them side by side, it makes a hexagon. But despite its impressive pedigree, it has a lot of design flaws. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer was built and designed around the tail end of the Clone Wars. Peace was on the horizon, and the last of the great droid clone battles were just memories of the past. Gearing up for a peacetime role, the Imperial Navy was heavily invested in the Tarkin Doctrine. The idea was to strike fear into the hearts of dissenters in the Empire and make the cost of rebelling so high that it just wasn't worth it. Now, obviously, that plan didn't really work out that well. The destruction of Alderaan unified the rebel factions of the galaxy. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer was a product of the Tarkin Doctrine. In many ways, it was the direct successor of the Republic Venator-class Star Destroyer, but on steroids. And sticking out of the imposing design was an enormous bridge, which commanded an impressive view for the crew and reminded the citizens of the Empire that the Imperial Navy was always watching them. While it looked cool and very scary, it was actually a terrible military design. Having a giant transparent steel window is a luxury one might expect on a Starliner or in a rec room on a troop carrier. Having a giant window on your bridge actually exposes your crew to a lot of unnecessary danger. You see, the skipper doesn't actually pilot the ship based on visual cues. That's a romantic misconception a lot of us have about spaceflight. Instead, there's an entire team supporting the skipper, engineers, navigators, all of them using a plethora of sensors, cameras located throughout the ship. The giant window is just there for epic hero shots of the commanding officer. Not only is the giant window really stupid, the placement of the bridge is quite idiotic as well. The most important part of the ship, the nerve center of the entire vessel, full of the most important decision-making officers, should be heavily shielded and placed in the part of the ship with the thickest armor possible. Ideally, that's the middle of the ship. Now, there is a backup crew and a backup bridge on board, but you don't pay Tom Brady $20 million a year to have him run a naked bootleg, get hurt, and then put in Brian Hoyer. Who the hell is Brian Hoyer? Located on top of the bridge are also two very important and exposed pieces of technology, the two shield generators. The reason for this location is the closer proximity to the generators, the more powerful the shields are. And obviously, if you have a really stupidly exposed bridge, you want maximum protection on there. But this, of course, causes a lot more problems. Instead of spreading the generators evenly across the ship, you have them right next to each other, and given their weakness to projectiles like small ships or proton torpedoes, it's possible for both of them to be taken out or at least damaged by one attack run. This also means the shields are heavily concentrated to the top of the ship, leaving the underside exposed. On top of that, you have fewer gun emplacements underneath the ship and a giant exposed hangar door, presenting a very obvious weak side of the ship to the enemy. A better option would be to spread the shield generators across the entire ship instead of just focusing on one side. But of course, you would also need to move the bridge within the ship. On top of that, the communications suite was also placed in the shield dome, which means you're betting a lot on those vulnerable structures not getting destroyed. Another problem with shields on Imperial-class Star Destroyer was the lack of redundancy. A ship as large as the Imperial-class Star Destroyer usually has a backup hyperdrive and bridge, so why not shields? Instead of having just two massive generators, why not have multiple ones that can replace each other if they fail? This was the strategy that the Rebel Mon Calamari cruisers used. This is why, despite being heavily outgunned by an ISD, the MC-80s were able to hold their own in a broadside exchange because of their smaller, more plentiful shields, which were constantly recharging and able to handle and absorb more damage. During the Battle of Scarif, a flight of Y-Wings were able to disable a Star Destroyer with a rack of ion torpedoes. Ion weapons send highly charged particles that are disruptive to the atomic structure of objects. Technically, an ion explosion that can penetrate a ship's particle shields and then disable the engine should kill everyone on board, but whatever, science. From a design point of view, it seems kind of stupid that the ship isn't well shielded from this type of particle weapon, especially when you're flying through space and constantly exposed to dangerous cosmic rays. Anyway, the main power plant should be better protected. If you don't have a power plant, you don't have shields, weapons, hyperdrives, even life support. And as we all know, a giant Star Destroyer dead in the water is extremely vulnerable. It's probably a good idea to shield the generator room with some Dunium. If that material was good enough to serve as a shield for the Death Star laser dish, it should be able to stop a few iron torpedoes, right? An Imperial-class Star Destroyer has 60 Time and Bach XX9 heavy turbo laser batteries, 60 Borstel NK7 ion cannons, 6 dual heavy turbo laser turrets, 2 dual heavy ion cannon turrets, 2 quad heavy turbo lasers, 3 triple medium turbo lasers, 2 medium turbo lasers, and 1 Phylon 07 tractor beam projector. That's enough firepower to make your average gun nut cream his or her pants. But if you really do know naval ships, you'll see a glaring weakness in this type of armament. Where the hell are the point defense weapons, the anti-ship missiles? Large naval ships, like a Star Destroyer, are supposed to have layered defenses.
Layers! Onions have layers. Ogres have layers.
Let's take a look at the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier's armament. First, you have long-range anti-aircraft missiles, then you have short-range phalanx automated defense turrets. And then a bunch of 50 cals to deal with pirates and dolphins trying to board and molest our brave sailors. On the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, we have a severe lack in point defense and short-range weapons. All we have are like 5 medium turbo lasers. And they'll have a hard time hitting a Corvette, let alone a tiny A-Wing. And you guys remember what happened the last time a few snow fighters went against a large construct that only had turbo lasers? Exactly. Now, an argument could be made that the Star Destroyer's primary goal is to focus on other large ships, kind of like a battleship from World War I. It could also be argued that it's up to smaller cruisers and escort frigates to handle the smaller ships and smaller fighters. But let's think about it. How many times have we seen Star Destroyers just all by themselves without any escort fleets? That's 3 for 3 in opening scenes for the original trilogy. That's a huge tactical oversight by the Empire. That or George Lucas's, team ran out of budget or something like that. Now, in all fairness, the Imperial-class Star Destroyer wasn't completely defenseless against smaller ships. It did have a complement of 72 TIE fighters on board, which is adequate for most situations, but these TIE fighters lack shields and adequate firepower and were usually outgunned by Rebellion fighters. And despite being much larger than the Venator-class Star Destroyer, the ISD actually has a smaller amount of fighters on board. The older Venator-class Star Destroyer might have had less firepower, but they held a complement of over 400 fighters. You'd think with the cheap production costs of the TIE Fighter, the Empire would have increased the ISD's fighter complement, or at least kept it at the same level as the Venator. Especially when you look at the Imperial Navy's mission. It's peacekeeping. They're dealing with civilian ships that are usually no larger than a freighter. Rarely do they ever see another capital-sized ship like a Star Destroyer. Despite having only 72 TIE fighters, it still takes quite a long time to deploy all the TIE fighters out of an ISD, and that's because there's only one hangar door. And as stated before, the placement of the hangar door is at the weakest point of the ship. One well-placed proton torpedo could effectively wipe out the entire ship's ability to defend itself from starships. A better alternative to one massive hangar with one massive door would be to have several different hangars with their own doors. This would allow the Star Destroyer to quickly launch its entire complement of fighters. One of the strengths of the Rebel Snuff fighters was the fact that they had hyperdrives. This meant that they didn't need to go through the timely process of launching out of a capital ship after reverting from hyperspace. This meant they oftentimes could deliver their payload and then revert back to hyperspace before the TIE fighters were even scrambled out of their capital ship. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer also carried an impressive amount of stormtroopers, 9,000. That's an entire legion. There was, however, a major bottleneck in their deployment. The ISD only could carry 8 Lambda-class shuttles, which each held around 20 soldiers. And because the ISD was not rated for combat insertion, that's what she said, you could only land 160 soldiers at one time. It would take around 56 trips to deploy the entire legion, and that's if enemy fighters or anti-air emplacements don't take out some of the 8 shuttles on board. This just invites an Ia Drung Valley-like scenario to happen. And should that happen, should your troops get surrounded by the Star Wars equivalent of the Viet Cong, it'll take a really long time to withdraw your troops. 56 trips. I'm also confused on how AT-AT walkers and other heavy vehicles get deployed. Now, in Legends, there are larger landing craft vehicles that help land all this material onto the surface of a planet, but so far Disney canon only has one answer, and it's this. At the end of the day, the Imperial-class Star Destroyer was a very impressive ship. As a matter of fact, with a few fixes, it would have been very useful, say, during the Yuzhang Vong invasion. But for a peacekeeping mission across a vast galaxy, it was too large, too expensive, and used way too many resources and manpower. A dozen lighter cruisers would have been cheaper to deploy and be able to cover a dozen more systems and be more capable at handling your average moisture farmer in their T-16 Skyhopper or Clone Wars era Y-Wing. Now, having said all this negative stuff about the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, I do like it. I mean, there's a certain appeal to it. It's magnificent, beautiful, awe-inspiring, but impractical. In our last video, we looked at the 10 flaws of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer. I said one of the issues with the design was that the shield generators were concentrated onto the top of the ship, and therefore areas far away from the top of the ship had weaker shields, making the bottom of the Star Destroyer a vulnerable area to attack. Many of you pointed out that there's a bulge at the bottom of the Star Destroyer, which might be another shield generator, but according to canon, that bubble houses the primary power generator, which is kind of another design flaw, allowing your enemy to visually see where your main power source is. There is one more shield generator on the Star Destroyer, and that is at the prow of the vessel, but it's a navigational shield mainly used to stop debris from hitting the ship. So if you do want to attack an ISD, go for its soft, weak belly. The next thing I do want to talk about is a little bit more serious. Recently, in a small village in southern France called Ledanovic, the beaches were closed after a dolphin reportedly raped several beachgoers. Now, I know a lot of Americans, Brits, Croatians, basically half the world don't really like French people. But the key word there is people. The French are humans, just like you and me. They're not all that different. And no one deserves to be raped by a dolphin while they're just trying to enjoy a nice swim in the ocean. So we send our best wishes to the survivors and victims of this terrible tragedy. Hashtag horny dolphingate, hashtag humanity first. Anyway, on to stormtroopers now. We know this video will most likely be controversial because everyone loves or hates stormtroopers. And there's also almost half a century worth of movies, comics, novels, and video games about them, all with contradicting information. So as usual, we'll be trying to focus on Disney's kind of vague canon version of the stormtrooper, and whenever we really do need to dig deeper for information, we'll go into legends for a little bit. I truly am sorry if our version of the stormtrooper is not the same as the one you grew up with, but hey, at least you're not getting impregnated by a dolphin. A stormtrooper outfitted in full combat armor is one of the most iconic images in Star Wars. Most of us at one time or another have dreamed about putting on that white suit of armor and embarking on a village pacification mission where we get to kick in the teeth of some furry Ewoks. But that awesome looking suit of armor is a classic example of form over function. Stormtrooper armor is made up of an insulated body glove that has 18 separate pieces of armor attached onto it made out of plastoid composites. Now we're not exactly sure how heavy that armor is, but we do know that Clone Trooper Phase 1 armor, which the Stormtrooper armor evolved from, was around 40 kilograms. Phase 1 armor included 20 individual plates of a similar plastoid composite. Clone Trooper armor was known for having excellent protection, but it was also extremely heavy and restrictive. Stormtrooper armor, which shares more similarities with Phase 2 clone armor, should be lighter than Phase 1 Clone Trooper armor, but still is a full suit of armor and therefore quite heavy and restrictive. Armor, since man first strapped a piece of animal skin over his nutsack, has always been a trade-off between protection and mobility. Modern infantry soldiers with a full combat load carry around 30 kilos. That includes a rucksack, their weapons, and all of their equipment. But even all that still weighs less than the Stormtrooper armor by itself. Most modern infantry units only wear ballistic helmets and vests along with a plate carrier with trauma plates protecting the chest and maybe groin and collar regions. Even so, all this protection only weighs around 15 kilos. Any more weight or coverage would limit the mobility and stamina of a soldier. And the idea is really not to test your armor against bullets in the first place. It's kind of a last resort emergency measure. It's just as important to be alert and quick enough to find cover so that you don't get shot in the first place. In my opinion, Stormtrooper armor is way too heavy and also severely limits mobility. Also, unlike the clones, the Stormtroopers weren't always being deployed in giant battlefields. They were mainly used for guard duty or in a peacekeeping role, both of which don't require such heavy armor. On top of that, the heavy, bulky type of armor that the Stormtroopers wore really limited their ability to move around in tight CQB scenarios that one might find inside of a city or in a starship. Despite its extremely heavy weight, the protection offered by Stormtrooper armor was a bit disappointing. While it did a good job against non-armor piercing projectiles and fragments and explosions, it didn't do such a great job against blaster bolts. The armor is capable of absorbing and even deflecting low energy bolts, but higher energy rounds are able to easily penetrate the armor. This is why the Empire heavily regulated more powerful blasters. So while small blaster pistols, which would be the real-world equivalent of a 9mm handgun, can be absorbed by the armor, something larger like Han's DL-44, which would be the real-world equivalent of a .44 Magnum or maybe a .45 ACP round, had enough power and force to knock Stormtroopers over and overwhelm the blastoid's ability to absorb energy. The Rebel A280 blaster rifle also seemed to have no problem penetrating Stormtrooper armor. So not only was Stormtrooper armor way too heavy, it also didn't offer enough protection to justify that weight. A better solution would have been to use a thicker plastoid composite like that found on the Katarn armor of Republic Commandos and fashion that into an armor system. In order to limit weight though, instead of covering the entire body, I would just have it cover the more vital parts of your body like your chest and groin. I'd rather have a smaller suit of armor that actually works rather than one that covers my entire body but doesn't really work all the time. While the Stormtrooper Corps was officially a part of the Imperial Army, most of the time they were deployed on ships, so they were kind of like Marines or Space Marines. Not only do they help naval troopers with ship security, they also were used as shock troopers for anti-piracy raids and boarding operations. This meant they were constantly being exposed to the dangers of vacuum. Now, despite the fact that they are covered head to toe in heavy plastoid composites, the stormtroopers' armor is actually not hermetically sealed. This seems like an odd design oversight for a full suit of armor designed for combatants stationed on a starship. In truth, they don't even need airtight suits. Just a small rebreather or oxygen tank would be enough to make sure that they can get back into the ship should they get blown out of an airlock. The suit is environmentally controlled, so if you're only taking a short walk in space, it shouldn't be a huge problem. You can't really talk about how terrible Stormtrooper armor is without talking about its color, or lack of color. In recent years, we have been introduced to different types of Stormtroopers that are more appropriately camouflaged, but how many brave Imperials have died over the years needlessly because they stuck out like a sore thumb in their environment? Unless the environment is snow or a field of Ewok ashes. Now, it's been said that the armor was white for a variety of reasons, and we did an entire video on that, so you can check that out. But none of those reasons really justify why the armor is white. You know what's worse than wearing white armor in a jungle? That's wearing white armor in a jungle and then being forced to polish it and keep it extremely clean every day for inspection while you're going on daily patrols where you're being ambushed by tiny teddy bears with superhuman strength. On top of that, you have many other different type of restrictions that just made being a Stormtrooper kind of horrible. Stormtroopers were far more fanatic and loyal to the Empire than your average soldier, yet the organization was still constantly being monitored by the Imperial Security Bureau. As a matter of fact, on a daily basis, the ISB was downloading the audio and visual feed on every Stormtrooper's helmet looking for slackers or traitors. They were even keeping track of whether Stormtroopers were taking off their helmets during patrols or not and punishing them if they found out that they were. This type of monitoring and enforcement of rules was not only damaging for morale, it's also a huge waste of resources and manpower. Stormtrooper helmets, another very controversial topic amongst the Star Wars community. Many rebels who have stolen helmets have reported that they are extremely uncomfortable to wear and also limit your visibility.
This helmet! I can't see!
On the other side of this argument, you have Imperial armor enthusiasts and Stormtroopers who have stated that these rebels don't know how to properly use these helmets and that most of these helmets were actually turned off. Well, we're going to take a middle road on this argument. While having a helmet with heads-up display with navigational aids and communication suite built in is a huge advantage, helmets, along with other systems in a Stormtrooper's armor, including the environmental controls, oftentimes malfunctioned or ran out of battery. At which point that state-of-the-art helmet becomes nothing more than a useless hunk of plastoid which limits your peripheral vision. Given the unpredictable rigors of combat and lack of reliability of these helmets, one change I would make to these helmets would be to have a removable face mask or a visor similar to a motorcycle helmet. That way, if your helmet does malfunction, you can just open up the front of it. That way the Stormtroopers won't need to remove their helmets and still have that basic head protection with a good field of view. And also, they won't have to worry about the ISB penalizing them for removing their helmets. Another controversial subject about Stormtroopers is how accurate they are.
Wow, you really do shoot like a stormtrooper.
Blast points, too accurate for sand people. Only Imperial stormtroopers are so precise.
Again, we'll be taking the middle road. I think as soldiers, Stormtroopers for the most part were highly trained and very accurate marksmen, but because of their poorly designed equipment, they oftentimes had problems hitting targets. Stormtroopers used a variety of weapons, but by far the most popular small arms that they used was the E11 blaster. This light versatile carbine weapon was quite useful in a range of situations and even had a non-lethal setting, a good design feature for a peacekeeping force. But one of the main problems was the E11's simplistic design paired with the bulky armor that the Stormtroopers wore. The E11 came stock with iron sights but also could be fitted with a small scope. But neither option really worked all that well with the Stormtrooper helmet. This is why during a lot of battles you can see Stormtroopers aiming from the hip or tucking the rifle against their shoulder but not really sighting the weapon. I actually think this is the root of the Stormtrooper problem. It's actually quite a simple fix. All you really need to do is include a targeting system for the blaster rifle inside the helmet. There's already a heads-up display built into the helmet, so a Stormtrooper would be able to fire accurately from the hip or even blind fire. Also, while you're at it, put a biometric lock on the weapon so rebels can't steal it. Stormtrooper training and military training in general in the Empire kind of reminds me of the Hunger Games. The Imperial Stormtrooper training program was designed with a very Sith-like mentality. Cadets were expected to outsmart each other, and competition was so intense sometimes cadets were injured or even died. And as long as you weren't caught in the act of sabotaging or killing another student, the instructors usually turned a blind eye. While this strategy might work in the business world, it's actually a terrible mindset to have when you're creating a military organization. What made the clone troopers so effective was that they all saw each other as brothers and fully trusted one another. Clones were so closely attuned to their fellow brothers that they were able to predict each other's movements, making them an extremely effective combat force. The Stormtrooper Corps and the Empire in general is full of sycophants, opportunists, and also psychopaths, which a lot of times meant that you had individuals within the organization fighting against each other instead of fighting together for the Empire. While most Stormtroopers were given first aid training, they were oftentimes too busy during a battle to stop and treat their fellow wounded. While all Stormtroopers have some basic first aid training, they're oftentimes way too busy in the middle of a firefight to stop and help the wounded. As a matter of fact, official Imperial policy forbade Stormtroopers to go and aid their fallen comrades until the enemy was eliminated. This meant a lot of Stormtroopers needlessly bled out because no one was able to reach them in time to stabilize their wound. The Stormtrooper Corps did have medics, but they were quite rare, and we really never get to see them in combat. The official policy also forbade Imperial medics from treating non-humans, and most medics carried an E11 for self-defense or if some alien scum started bothering them for treatment. In general, I think a quick way to reduce casualties is to just have more medics. As we mentioned before, the Stormtroopers were like the Marines of the Star Wars galaxy. Some might even call them Special Forces. The point is, they were mainly focused and trained on direct action. But a lot of times, the Stormtroopers were sent on mundane tasks which wasted their time. That would be followed by intense periods of non-stop fighting against heavily rebel cells. The Stormtroopers were basically used in almost every type of scenario, and there was a real risk of combat fatigue in these units. Sure, they were more capable than their army and naval counterparts, but having them constantly go on missions and patrols wore them out. On board a naval vessel, the Navy troopers should handle ship security, and on the ground, the Army troopers should be deployed as garrisons. Stormtroopers should only be used as shock troops. That's what they're trained and equipped for. Yet we continue to see overwhelming evidence that Stormtroopers were the most widely deployed units despite being a much smaller branch of the armed forces. Now, it's definitely not my first choice when it comes to starfighters, but there are actually some good qualities about the TIE Fighter. For one, it's probably one of the most efficiently produced vehicles in the Star Wars galaxy. Everything from its solar panels and engines are designed with minimal moving parts, making the assembly cheaper and making the TIE Fighter more reliable and easier to build. It's also an extremely maneuverable and fast fighter. And it kind of makes sense. With millions of systems to patrol, you want to limit the cost of your main starfighter. Perhaps the price and ease of production and maintenance alone offsets any flaws I'm going to mention, but still, for the sake of fandom, we must break down and analyze this TIE Fighter. The Star Wars galaxy is home to many different civilizations that are extremely advanced and able to travel many times faster than the speed of light. But for some reason, most space combat between starfighters still take place within line of sight. We're basically talking about World War I to Korean War era type dogfighting. Now, obviously, visually, it's a lot more interesting to see starfighters going at it at close range rather than have them shoot missiles from 1,000 miles away, so we're not going to target this aspect all that much. But we do have to take into account what this style of combat means for fighter design and, more importantly, cockpit design. You see, one of the most important parts of dogfighting, whether using autocannons or a Sidewinder missile, is having visibility. Erich Hartmann, a German Luftwaffe pilot from World War II, is credited with 352 kills on the Eastern Front. That's more than 2 times the kills that American sniper Chris Kyle had during his entire service. Now, sure, in the earlier years of the war, the Soviet pilots and aircraft were just terrible. Most Russian fighters lacked proper targeting sights, so pilots would just kind of draw them onto the front of their windshield. The pilots, on the other hand, were sometimes sent up with only 8 to 10 hours of flight time. But both the Soviet planes and pilots would eventually improve throughout the war, and the Reds would design some of the best planes of the war, like the Yak-3. Anyway, Hartmann flew over 1,400 sorties and was involved in aerial combat 823 times. He said he survived because of one reason. He never engaged an enemy if they saw him before he made his approach. If he was spotted, he would use his Bf-109's powerful engine to outrun enemy fighters. It was his stalking ability that allowed him to survive so many missions. He was also extremely lucky and crash landed 14 times without dying. Although he was never under fire in any of those situations, the guy was basically a ninja. So according to Eric Hartman, the most important part of dogfighting is actually just seeing your enemy before he sees you. And that's why when you look at fighters like the famous P-51 Mustang evolved throughout World War II, one of the main things that really changes besides engine size and armament is the canopy structure. The P-51A goes from having almost no rear visibility to a complete bubble canopy. The same thing happened with the P-47 Thunderbolt. Now let's take a look at the TIE Fighter canopy in comparison. It's almost laughable how bad it is. Sure, you have a great large front window, but there's zero visibility to the sides and the back of the vehicle. On top of that, because of the way the wings are designed, they further block the vision of the TIE Fighter on the sides. So a TIE Fighter would be extremely easy to sneak up on, especially if its sensors were jammed or if it was involved in another dogfight. This is probably one of the worst parts about the fighter's design. The TIE Fighter had only one weapon on board, and that was the LS-1 laser cannon. These were quite potent weapons and capable of quickly stripping the shield of a similar sized starship. It could even be used to strafe unarmored ground targets. But for anything larger than smaller unarmored targets, the TIE Fighter was more or less useless. It lacked any real anti-capital ship weapons like a proton or ion torpedo. Also, because the TIE Fighter only had line-of-sight weapons, they had to get extremely close to engage the enemy, exposing itself to danger. A quick fix would be just to put a torpedo launcher on the ship. Now, if the TIE Fighter was involved in more long-range combat using torpedoes or Separatist-style missiles, a deflector shield wouldn't really be that useful in that scenario. It's just not powerful enough to protect them from such a large explosion. Countermeasures and stealth tech are much more useful against large guided munitions, like we have here on Earth. But when the majority of the battles the TIE Fighters are engaged in are close-range knife fights using laser cannons, a deflector shield is actually the best defense, especially when you're in an environment where there's hundreds of pilots engaging each other. At this point, it's not about whether you'll get hit, but when. A stray laser glancing off your deflector shield in the middle of the battle is not really that big of a deal. But a stray laser glancing off of your windshield in the middle of a battle is a really big deal. As a matter of fact, without any shields or even armor, the transparent steel window on the front of the TIE Fighter now becomes a weak spot for micro-asteroids, space debris, even cosmetic radiation could kill you. And when you're traveling several thousands of miles per hour, it's almost impossible to see such a small piece of debris coming at you. It's almost suicide to fly without a deflector shield. Now, the TIE Fighter is designated as an in-space superiority fighter, but it's also deployed in atmosphere as well. As its name states, though, this TIE Fighter is mainly designed for spaceflight. In atmosphere, it's basically an odd-shaped box that is somehow able to power its way through every law of physics. The only reason the TIE Fighter is able to fly is because of how powerful repulsor technology is in Star Wars. But what about area resistance and gravitational propulsion? These awkwardly shaped wings give the craft terrible drag in all the wrong directions. Now, I'm not a rocket surgeon, but I feel like in real life a TIE Fighter would almost be impossible to fly and would also probably leave a very turbulent wake behind it. It's only because of advanced building materials, futuristic thrust capabilities, and inertial compensators to limit g-forces that a ship like this does not immediately go into an uncontrollable spin and rip itself apart. So if a TIE Fighter ever does lose power in atmosphere, it's basically just a flying rock. Well, actually, I think a rock would have better aerodynamic capabilities. There is one thing that saves the TIE Fighter pilot in that scenario, though. There is an ejection seat, but I'm not really sure if there's a parachute or not. So maybe that just delays the inevitable by a little bit. The giant wings on both sides of the TIE Fighter not only obstruct the view of the pilot and also make it extremely awkward to fly in atmosphere, it also serves as a giant beacon for sensors and radar. We've seen Star Wars ships use both sonar or radar style sensors to detect ships along with heat sensors. With two giant solar panels on the outside of your ship, you create two intense hotspots for people to track. When it comes to radar, however, the material that solar panels are made up of actually could absorb radar instead of reflecting it as much, making the TIE Fighter kinda stealthy. But unfortunately, the inside of the TIE Fighter wings aren't covered in solar panels and just serve as two gigantic paddles to reflect radar. So the TIE Fighter is not stealthy at all. And as we talked about before, dogfighting, especially close-range dogfighting, is all about seeing your enemy first. So having a gigantic sensor signal is not really a good idea. The Empire is really cheap, and trust me, I do get it. There's a lot of territory to cover, but there's cheap, and then there's just downright stupid. And by downright stupid, I mean including an anti-theft mechanism which allows a central control system to scuttle a TIE fighter if someone steals it. Now, I'm not talking about something practical like a remote engine switch. The Empire's anti-theft mechanism deattaches the wings from the central pod of the TIE fighter. So if that TIE fighter is in atmosphere, you're basically losing the entire ship. And to make the matter worse, it seems like the mechanism that is used to deattach the wings were just small explosives. So as if flying around in a not so aerodynamic starfighter that doesn't have any shields, that also doesn't have adequate life support, isn't dangerous enough, now you're gonna put explosives in the wings. The TIE fighter had to fit a multi-purpose role. It wasn't just a war machine, it also had to deal with peacekeeping operations. This meant anti-smuggling patrols and pulling over suspicious ships. The problem is almost every starship in the Star Wars galaxy has a hyperdrive. And because the TIE fighter also didn't have a tractor beam, it meant getting away from the Empire was as easy as jumping into hyperspace. Just think about how many rebels, pirates, and criminals got away from the Empire because the TIE fighter didn't have a hyperdrive. Perhaps there was enough personnel and materials to start a rebellion. The lack of a hyperdrive also severely limits the range of a TIE fighter and makes it over-dependent on the ship that it is stationed on. So let's say a kitchen fire destroys that Gazanti-class cruiser that was your home for the last few months. Well, now you're stuck in space and you're most likely going to run out of air before anyone finds you. And as we explained in our last video about Star Destroyers, because TIE fighters had to be deployed from the hangar of larger ships once they reverted to real space, it gave enemy fighters time to position themselves in a more advantageous way. Now, the official policy of the Empire was that TIE fighter pilots and TIE fighters were expendable. But that doesn't necessarily mean that TIE fighters were unskilled. As a matter of fact, most of the time they outclassed their rebel counterparts in both skill and training. You see, only the smartest, most talented individuals in the Imperial Navy actually were sent to flight school and then assigned as fighter pilots. We did an entire video that goes through what it takes to be an Imperial pilot. You can check it out here. And it's definitely not only extremely difficult, but it's also a time-consuming and expensive process. The Empire invested a lot of resources to find and train the right candidates. And these TIE fighter pilots weren't just pilots, they were accomplished mechanics, engineers, problem solvers, and leaders. Most of them were mechanically capable enough to strip down their entire TIE fighter and then rebuild it. So why spend that much time and energy training pilots if you're gonna just end up putting them inside of a flying coffin? Seems like a really stupid move. Limited by its design, TIE fighters were mainly used as a defensive layer around capital ships. Because of their lack of hyperdrives and long-range weapons, this often meant by the time they were able to engage and intercept enemy ships, they were already relatively close to their own carrier ships. Usually this meant the enemy was already within striking range of Imperial capital ships with proton torpedoes and ion torpedoes. Ideally, the TIE fighters should really intercept enemy ships way before they get within range of Imperial capital ships. On top of that, with the TIE fighters engaging in dogfights so close to their own ships, they effectively screen their own gunners from using their guns to attack enemy starships. This whole defensive strategy is really stupid. If you think about it, the TIE fighters are filling in the role that point defense weapons should have, and as we discussed before, Star Destroyers for some reason don't have point defense weapons. The Star Destroyers are much better off having smaller laser cannons on the whole rather than having dozens of starships randomly swarming across their gunners' firing lanes. Right after the rise of the New Order, the TIE fighter was introduced, and for the most part, it was kind of adequate at its job. When it came to combat, it holds its own quite well against Clone War era fighters and civilian ships. Of course, as we mentioned before, a lack of hyperdrive made it very easy to escape from a TIE fighter, but generally it wasn't a terrible design. But as the rebellion began to grow in size and their ships became more advanced, the TIE fighters quickly became outgunned and outclassed in almost every way. The TIE fighter was not only no longer able to compete, it was becoming a liability for the Empire. I'd go as far to say that had more advanced fighters like the TIE Interceptor been stationed on the Death Star, maybe the destruction of the Death Star could have been prevented. By the time the Battle of Yavin had started, the TIE fighter was already 19 years old. It's kind of ironic that the mighty Empire was flying 2-decade-old fighters, while the Ragtag Rebellion actually had the latest and most modern fighters in the galaxy. The TIE fighter really reminds me of the story of the Mitsubishi Zero, one of the premier fighters in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Limited by engine technology and economic sanctions, the Japanese designer Jiro Horikoshi faced many problems when designing the Zero. He decided to limit the weight of the aircraft to such an extreme length that it actually became more maneuverable and advanced than any other fighter at the time. But this was all at the expense of protection. The cockpit lacked any real armor for the pilot, and the plane didn't even have a self-sealing fuel tank. The Zero, like the TIE Fighter, was a flying coffin that oftentimes erupted in flames. But at least in the beginning of the war, the Zero had an excellent kill-to-death ratio, around 12-1. But as the war advanced, the Allied powers introduced more powerful and heavier aircraft that were able to match the Zero and eventually surpass it. This story is a reminder that combat and technology is fluid, and if you don't innovate, if you don't advance your own designs, you're going to fall behind. Now, before we begin today's episode, I do want to talk to you guys about something that's very serious. Scientists have recently figured out that dolphins are now passing on skills and knowledge to their peers and family members. This startling news came out after a few dolphin sympathizers rehabbed the dolphin and taught it how to do something known as tail walking. This gives a dolphin the ability to literally walk on water, a skill as far as we know only one human has achieved so far. These naive humans had no idea that this dolphin, once released into the wild, would go on to teach the whole population of dolphins in the neighboring area how to tail walk. My question to you is, how long do you think it'll take these dolphins to learn how to walk on land so that they can attack us in our homes where we live? Hashtag humanity first. The Death Star was really just the fancy housing for the Mark I super laser. Actually, most of the technology that they needed to build the Death Star was already invented. The super laser was really the only thing that was quite complicated on the station. The technology focused around using giant kyber crystals to amplify energy coming out of a hypermatter reactor. Now, this had never been done before, which is why they hired a talented scientist like Galen Erso, although they had to trick him into believing that he was working on a sustainable energy project, which actually isn't all that far from the truth. See, he was able to make the kyber crystals create energy out of thin air, which is actually quite incredible. Here on Earth, we're limited by the law of conservation of energy, which states that energy can either be created or destroyed. The result was a weapon that could output a crazy amount of energy, many times stronger than the energy source the weapon was powered by. Within just 3 seconds, the reactor at full power on board the Death Star was able to output as much energy as our sun does in an entire week. The result was a weapon that could destroy an entire planet. Even a single reactor ignition shot could devastate the giant swaths of the surface of a planet, making it completely uninhabitable. But the truth was, the Death Star at any power level was overpowered and unnecessary, especially if you're trying to run an empire. Why would you want something that can destroy entire planets? Even though there were billions of planets in the galaxy, the habitable ones are still quite rare and precious. And there are many better ways to destroy your enemy than by destroying their entire planet. After all, you are an empire, you need more territory, right? So the Death Star was a project fueled purely by excessive amounts of ego and hubris. Even the Sith empires of old tried their best not to destroy entire planets. They actually had a much more humane way to cleanse local populations, primarily using precision orbital bombardments using turbo lasers from Star Destroyers. And the Death Star took an incredibly long time to recharge after firing, especially when it was fired at full power. Sometimes it would take 24 hours to fully recharge, and no, you couldn't get some gold coins that you bought with real-world money to speed up the process. So let's say you actually do need a weapon as powerful as the Death Star. Maybe you're facing a Yuzhang Vong fleet with world ships, and the Star Destroyers you have at your disposal aren't doing a great job. Well, the first thing you should do is make an upgrade to the reactor, just like the Empire did in the second Death Star. This would increase the recharge rate. Now let's take a look at how we can make construction more efficient, cheaper, and faster. So like we said before, the Death Star station is really just an expensive housing for the laser. And if you look at the size of the Death Star, it's actually way too large. It's 160 kilometers in diameter. It's completely unnecessary to be that large because the actual weapon is only around 30 kilometers long. You see, the First Order actually had the right idea when it came to building super weapons. Instead of mining billions of tons of Durasteel Dunium, they just used the planet to house their gigantic star-powered weapon instead. And because the Death Star weapon is smaller than Starkiller Base, you don't really even need a planet or a moon, just a decent-sized asteroid to fit your weapon in. This would be much cheaper and faster to build, allowing you to potentially build multiple Death Stars. And that's a much better use of resources if you ask me. Now, Disney canon seems really confused about what kind of protection the Death Star actually had. From what we can tell, it had multiple shield clusters scattered across the surface, similar to the Mon Calamari cruisers. This makes sense. With a surface as large as the Death Star, you want to have different sectors with different shields, that way the entire shield doesn't need to be dropped when you have ships coming in and out. The problem during the Battle of Yavin 4 is the rebels are somehow able to fly extremely close to the Death Star and even through its trenches, which means somehow they got through the Death Star's shield. In Star Wars, there are 3 different types of shields. First, you have your particle shields, and that stops physical objects like torpedoes or starfighters. The second type of shield is a ray shield, which stops energy-based weapons like a blaster bolt. And the third type of shield is a plot shield, which protects protagonists from dying when they do stupid stuff like this. While it's possible to get through the ray shield while moving relatively slow, it doesn't seem to make sense that the Death Star would only be protected by ray shields. It should have particle shields as well. After all, almost every military ship has a combination of the 2 shields, including a navigational shield, which could stop space debris. Now, we do know that the rebels pass through electromagnetic field, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's associated with a deflector shield. Which really is confusing because, as we've seen on Scarif, the Empire's technology to build planet-sized shields many times larger than the Death Star, and also include many gates in the shield so that ships can come in and out. And as we saw in Rogue One, the shield was able to stop all sorts of attacks, including starfighters trying to fly through it. The second Death Star also had a similar defense. And if the generator inside the Death Star is powerful enough to create as much energy as the sun does in 7 days, I think it's powerful enough to power a planetary shield. So let's just say that the Empire decided not to put a giant shield generator on the Death Star. Maybe it's too expensive, maybe they're too confident in its design. Who knows? How else can you protect the Death Star? Well, there's over 15,000 turbo lasers and 768 tractor beams scattered across the surface of the ship. That's enough firepower to engage multiple fleets and win. But the problem with these giant turbo lasers was they just weren't fast enough to track smaller fighters. They also were fired by gun crews instead of being automated with advanced tracking devices. And then surprisingly, there's no point defense weapons. Although that's kind of a problem on almost every Imperial ship larger than a light cruiser. This is how a few dozen Rebel snub fighters were able to infiltrate the surface and exploit its design flaw. The only defense that the Death Star had against starfighters was the TIE Fighter, and well, we've made a whole video about why they weren't all that great either. Now, even though the Death Star had 15,000 turbo lasers, it was kind of odd that no permanent fleet was assigned to it. As good as the defense on board was against other capital ships, it's always better to intercept the enemy before they reach their target. As we all know, the Death Star was impressive and large, but vulnerable because it lacked shields and point defense weapons. A defensive fleet could also help outflank enemies that were engaged in the Death Star. They can also be used for away missions or patrolling the nearby area and screening the station from enemy action. It kind of seems odd to me that the Empire would create something as expensive as the Death Star, but not give it any protection. Although in George Lucas' defense, they really stretched the budget for the first Star Wars movie, so most likely they couldn't afford to put any more Star Destroyers on screen. Let's be honest, guys, the Death Star was a terrible use of Imperial resources. We actually did a video where we calculated all the other things the Empire could have bought instead of the Death Star, and it's kind of embarrassing. You can check out the video here. For instance, we figured out that the Empire could build almost 7,000 Star Destroyers with that money. That's enough Star Destroyers to cover at least 7,000 different systems, which is a much better investment in my opinion. And it also spreads out your resources so that they can't be destroyed in one shot. The Death Star only had one purpose. It was to destroy planets, and somehow that would create stability in the galaxy. Yet its immense size meant that almost 1 million Imperials were stationed on board. And these weren't just your average Imperials, they were the best of the best. The most talented engineers, pilots, stormtroopers. The Death Star was a place only the elite were stationed. Now, if the designers had taken some of my ideas, like putting the Death Star inside of an asteroid or automating some of its turrets, they could have drastically decreased the size of the station and the manpower necessary to operate it. They could have also automated a lot of the systems on board and used droids to perform maintenance duties. That's exactly what the First Order did when they refitted the Imperial-class Star Destroyer Mark II for service. They simply had less manpower than the Empire had, but their refit of the ISD allowed them to operate these ships with a much smaller crew. When the first Death Star was destroyed, it dropped the Empire into a major economic depression and also killed off some of the most talented men and women in the Empire. This meant across the galaxy, younger and less experienced officers and enlisted men were being promoted into higher positions, which weakened the Empire's fighting capability. The architect of a large portion of the Death Star was a man named Galen Erso. He was recruited by his former schoolmate in the Republic Futures program, director Orson Krennic. At the time, Galen Erso was one of the leaders in the field of crystallography and the use of crystals in energy refinement. Erso was a pacifist by nature and extremely curious about the civilian applications of a kyber crystal. Krennic was far more ambitious than his friend, but much less talented. He was able to trick Galen into joining Project Celestial Power. This was a shell program that was aiming to create new power sources that could rebuild the galaxy that was left in ruins after the Clone Wars. Of course, Project Celestial Energy was just the cover for the Death Star program. Galen Erso and his fellow scientists were isolated from each other and tasked with designing small portions of the weapons independently, so they had no idea what they were helping to build. But Galen Erso quickly found out what the entire project was about and decided to take his family and run away from the Empire. Krennic does eventually find Galen and brings him back to the project. But by this point, Orson Krennic should have known that Galen Erso was not to be trusted. Yet for some reason, he was placed in charge of designing a significant portion of the weapon, including the reactor module, which he would eventually go on to sabotage. My question here is, why would they take a theoretical scientist and researcher and put him in charge with actually engineering the weapon itself? They obviously should have never trusted a man like Erso and should have just had a more loyal engineer take a look at his research. Now, the Geonosians were the ones who first started constructing the outer shell for the Death Star. Given the hive mind-like mentality of the species, they were well suited for the job. But once the Clone Wars ended and the Republic turned into the Empire, Palpatine decided to genocide the entire Geonosian species because he thought they knew too much about the project. He replaced this very reliable workforce with slaves, primarily Wookiee slaves. I'm not really sure why they used Wookiees. They were actually terrible slaves if you really think about it. They're incredibly strong, great fighters, free-spirited, and the only way you could really control them was by putting an explosive collar around their neck and then by kidnapping their family and putting explosive collars on their neck to use as leverage. This is an incredibly complicated process, and brute strength really doesn't matter as much in zero-gravity situations. Plus, there are all sorts of tools that can do the heavy lifting for you. On top of that, Wookiees were quite smart, and I'm sure they sabotaged a lot of their own work in order to stall the Empire. Plus, slavery is not only morally disgusting, it's also economically not sustainable. You're essentially taking able-bodied people out of the workforce and the economy and driving them to their deaths working on a stupid giant battle station. A better alternative would have been to hire people and just pay them decent wages. And well, I guess if you really didn't want anyone to know about the project, you could have just used droids. The Tarkin Doctrine was the main driving force behind the Death Star, even though it was Orson Krennic's brainchild. You see, the director really had no plans on how to utilize the weapon. He just wanted to create a giant laser, like any mad scientist would. Wilhelm Tarkin, however, believed that patrolling the immense territory that the Empire had with conventional forces was doomed to fail. He had come from a very harsh world in the Outer Rim and believed that nature's natural state was chaotic and could only be controlled by brute strength and force. He believed that the only way to create stability across the galaxy was to create a gigantic, credible threat of force, the Death Star. But instead of just testing the battle station on an uninhabited planet, Tarkin made the huge mistake of using it on Alderaan. Once the Death Star was fired at Alderaan, that credible threat of force that was supposed to keep people in line actually made them so scared that many of them joined the rebellion to fight against the Empire. You see, Alderaan was more than just a planet. It was a cultural center for the galaxy and human race. It was always seen as an untouchable permanent fixture in the core of the galaxy, too valuable to destroy. By blowing up Alderaan, Tarkin shattered the illusion that the Empire was some benevolent force that was trying to bring stability to the galaxy. Even if there were a few hundred terrorists on the planet and a stockpile of weapons, it didn't really justify the death of several billion people. By blowing up Alderaan, Tarkin had started the beginning of the end of the Empire. A much better way to stabilize the galaxy would be to strengthen the economy, and then trap all those potential rebels into boring office jobs. Guys, I know a lot of you came into this video already knowing what's wrong with the Death Star, but I hope we did enlighten you to some new possibilities. Now, a lot of you guys out there complained that I only covered the quote-unquote bad factions in Star Wars. And you know what, guys? You are right. We should be covering the so-called good guys in the Star Wars universe as well.
Great shot!
So today we'll be looking at the little-known Rebel Alliance infantry. And yes, they are little known, because if you really think about it, in the original trilogy, we only see rebel infantry on the ground during the Battle of Endor, and those guys were technically aligned special forces anyway. It wasn't until Rogue One that we finally saw some true rebel infantry, and even then never in large deployments. As a matter of fact, most of the time in the movies we only see the Alliance Navy. Why is that? Well, it's because the Rebel Alliance Navy, while small, was well equipped, well funded, and arguably had better snub fighters than the Empire did. And the original trilogy was, for all intents and purposes, created post-Galactic Civil War as a series of propaganda films for the fledgling New Republic. With the Empire defeated and the New Republic struggling to fill its vacuum, they released movies like this to remind the populace of how much the rebellion had sacrificed to win them their freedom in the first place. The films were actually written and produced by a well-known Luke the Butcher of Yavin 4 Skywalker apologist. He purposely left the rebel infantry out of his movies because before the Battle of Endor, rebel ground forces failed to win even one large set-piece ground battle against the Empire. The importance of the mid-rim offensive after Yavin 4 is completely overblown. After they managed to surprise a few Imperial garrisons, they quickly lost all of that ground in what was known as the mid-rim retreat. In reality, only a few small rebel companies were able to actually stand in a firefight against even a regular Imperial Army unit, let alone an elite stormtrooper company. And we'll explain to you guys why in this video when we break down the 10 major flaws with the rebel infantry. The Rebel Army was not a professional organization, and it wasn't structured like a professional army either. There is very little oversight. Deployed units would have limited communications from Central Rebel Command, and most command decisions were made at the company level. It wasn't all that different from the Rebel Alliance's earlier days when they were just a bunch of different rebel cells loosely associated with each other. This decentralized structure meant that the rebel companies were highly independent, and when Rebel Central Command was compromised, like they were during the Battle of Yavin 4 and Hoth, the rest of the rebellion would still be able to function. But overall, it made it very hard for the rebellion to coordinate large-scale battles, which is why they really didn't win any large-scale battles until after the Battle of Endor. Without a better unified command structure, the few rebel victories on the ground were usually carried out by small units or special forces against smaller Imperial targets. Unit quality and loyalty varied from company to company. The Imperial Navy generally had better educated and individualistic recruits. They also had more mobility and access to starships, which is why several pilots and officers defected to the Rebel Navy. It was much rarer for members of the Imperial Army, and especially the fanatic Stormtrooper Corps, to defect to the Rebel Army. So rebellion ground forces weren't made up of career soldiers, but teachers, politicians, mechanics, and really a random assortment of individuals. It wasn't until you got higher into the command structure that you had actual former soldiers, whether it be former Imperials like Crix Medine or even older veterans from the Clone Wars. So even at the company level, the leadership really varied depending on which unit you were in. You had units like the 61st Mobile Infantry, which was led by Captain Hal, who was a former teacher. He believed in fighting for a higher moral ground and trained his soldiers to limit civilian casualties and collateral damage. While this meant higher casualties for his own forces, this also attracted more new recruits and generally gave the rebellion a good name. Hal understood that the rebellion could never completely destroy the Empire through a conventional war. They were simply too large and well equipped. Instead, the rebellion needed to inspire more people to join their ranks and eventually overthrow the Empire. It was all about the hearts and minds. But for every Hal, you also had a Saw Gerrera who was focused on inflicting as much damage on the Empire, even if it meant killing non-combatants. Even though Saw's partisans eventually were forced out of the rebellion, many other rebel units were still known for using similar tactics. But since the New Republic won the war, it will remain forever unknown how many war crimes were actually committed by rebel troops. A lot of the behavioral problems and war crimes committed by rebel troops was the result of very relaxed recruiting standards. During the mid-rim offensive and retreat, most rebel infantry companies suffered massive casualties and were forced to recruit from the local civilian populace. There were no official rebellion recruiters to give people medical checks, background checks, and interviews. There weren't even any reserves to send to the front lines. A depleted rebel infantry unit would set up a recruiting area, because there's always the chance that an Imperial loyalist might run into the middle of a rebel camp, go all Admiral Akbar with a suicide vest, and kill a lot of people. The recruiting was actually done by NCOs or squad leaders who walked around and chose the people they wanted on their team. I'm pretty sure that's how Trader Joe's also hires. And oftentimes these recruits were murderers, thieves, or individuals just looking for a ride off the planet that the rebellion had just destroyed. And it was quite difficult for the rebellion to root out Imperial spies amongst the recruits' ranks. Now, as you might have suspected, because there's no official recruiting process, there's also no real official training process either, especially for units that were in the field. Again, training was up to your squad leader or NCO. And not only did some recruits not have any combat experience, some were from completely primitive worlds that didn't even have basic things like electricity or toilets, so you also had a cultural and technological barrier to overcome. And again, that's why someone like Captain Hal, who was a teacher, made such a good rebel commander, because his company was a training company as well as a combat company. Now, some special rebel units did receive extra training at Rebel Central Command, but most general infantry units were trained whenever or wherever a rebel company had a moment to rest. In theory, the standard rebel infantry weapon was the Blastech A280. In reality, the rebels used whatever they could get their hands on, whether that was a captured Imperial E11, a clone-era DC-15, or even an old-school select-thrower marksman rifle. Most regular rebel infantry also didn't wear any armor, as the rebellion didn't issue any. Even most rebellion special forces went into battle with just basic fatigues. That's not to say that the rebel soldiers didn't pick up stormtrooper armor or pieces of Durasteel and strap it onto their chest. Another problem was that most units didn't even have standard unit patches, let alone uniforms, making it extremely difficult for the rebel units to identify each other. This basically made your average rebel soldier an unlawful combatant in the eyes of Imperial law, which means they had no rights when they were captured. But the lack of standardization wasn't just because of the rebellion's lack of resources. They are actually better funded than most people knew. The bigger problem was their utter lack of logistic support. In reality, only headquarter and central command units had standardized equipment on par with the professional army. Your average rebel infantry company at best looked like a bunch of mercenaries, and at worst looked like a bunch of bandits, and also acted like bandits. Unlike the Empire, the rebellion didn't have a human-only policy for recruitment. They were desperate for manpower after all. This meant supplying armor and uniforms, and even weapons was extremely difficult. A Twi'lek needs a different type of helmet from a Zabrak. A jacket that would fit on a human definitely won't fit on a Basilisk. And I'm pretty sure if you try to put pants on a Hutt or a Wookiee, they'll try to kill you. So it was a mess right from the get-go. And even if the rebellion could create a supply chain that could equip all of these oddly shaped aliens, the Rebel Navy lacked the ships to supply everyone. That's why most rebel infantry units functioned as small, self-sustaining armies. The 61st Mobile Infantry was stationed out of a CR-90 Corvette and had only one gunship to support them. They really couldn't depend on Rebel Central Command for anything, so they had to scrounge for their own food, medical supplies, ammunition, and even vehicles. This, at the best of times, put a strain on relations between the rebel soldiers and local populaces. Any prolonged stay in any area could not be sustained without some light pillaging and raiding. And rebel units oftentimes lacked standardized ground vehicles as well, and usually stole and repurposed whatever civilian vehicles they could find. Because most of these units lacked reliable vehicles, they weren't mobile as they needed to be. One of the major reasons why the rebellion couldn't really win major ground battles was because of their lack of naval support. The Rebel Navy in the earlier days of the war had at best a few hundred ships compared to the Galactic Navy's several hundreds of thousands of ships. And in Star Wars, he who controls orbit controls the ground battle as well. Because once orbital bombardment begins, the battle on the ground is over. And most of these Rebel infantry companies had at best a few X-Wings or maybe a gunship protecting their space assets, which meant as soon as a Star Destroyer came to the system, they had to hightail it out of there. This limited most Rebel infantry units to hit-and-run tactics. Not only did the rebellion lack naval support, they also had a lack of heavy weaponry on the ground as well. Perhaps the most effective weapon emplacement the rebels had were just ion cannons, which could disable a Star Destroyer temporarily. But besides that, they had very little firepower underneath their command. Echo Base at the time was supposed to be one of the most heavily guarded rebel positions, and it didn't even have any weapons capable of stopping an AT-AT. This problem was even worse for rebel infantry not fighting from a prepared fixed position. Aside from a shoulder-launched anti-tank weapon, the rebels had no way of really combating anything larger than an AT-ST. Lastly, the rebellion was a volunteer force. Rebel commanders knew that most of the time they were sending their soldiers to certain death against much better equipped and trained forces. Morale usually wasn't great. Combine that with terrible logistics and a high casualty rate along with very little pay, and you had a lot of people deserting. Sometimes entire battalions would just fade away after a battle. And the rebellion didn't have the resources to go after the people who went AWOL. At the end of the day, the Alliance didn't win the war because of the rebel infantry. The Alliance won the war despite the rebel infantry. Captain Hal was right. This battle was purely ideological. The rebellion just needed to survive and occasionally win a victory so that more civilians would join the cause. The rebel infantry had its purposes, but for the most part, they were getting slaughtered by stormtroopers or slaughtering civilians themselves to steal their belongings. That's why after the Galactic Civil War, most of the veterans that were highlighted by popular media were usually pilots from the Rebel Navy, not the Rebel Army. So guys, those are our 10 flaws for the Rebel Infantry. As you can see, there's a reason why we don't see a lot of these guys in the movies. They just weren't really that good at their jobs. Of course, there's like Rogue One, and then you had your 61st Mobile Infantry, but most of the time they were just cannon fodder, let's be honest. Today we're going to look at the venerated X-Wing, the starfighter of the Rebel Alliance, Luke Skywalker and Poe Dameron. Rebel propaganda films have blown this ship's legacy to almost godlike proportions, so it might be a little bit hard for us to come up with 10 flaws, but we'll try our best. Every fighter in the X-Wing line can be identified by their unique X-shaped wing structure. In the Star Wars galaxy, these wings are known as S-foils or strike foils. Specifically on the X-Wing, these foils were closed when a ship was cruising at high speeds and opened up into attack position during dogfights and ground attacks.
Lock S-foils in attack position.
S-foils have always been a common feature on Incom designed ships. The ARC 170, which inspired many of the X-Wing's designs, also incorporated these flaps.
Set S-foils in attack position.
The S-foils had cooling radiators built into them and would open up during high energy use, like when the laser cannons were cycling. The X-Wing increased the size of the S-foils for increased cooling power, but the trade-off was that without the foils open, the X-Wing's weapons would be disabled. This 1 or 2 seconds that it does take to open up the S-foils to allow a pilot to fire could be costly, especially in an ambush situation where an X-Wing pilot is unprepared. There's also a bigger issue with the S-foil design is that it doesn't really work in vacuum. By opening up the S-foils, the X-Wing exposes an air-cooled radiator built into the wing that is relatively old technology. For any of you guys who have ridden an older motorcycle or have built your own PC, you know how this works. You have a heat sink that uses airflow to conduct heat away from the more sensitive components in your machine. This is why certain bikes are terribly hot on your man parts when you're sitting in traffic where there's no airflow. It's also why the fans in your gaming rig are running at such high speeds when you're running your video card at max load. Early aircraft used surface radiators also, which functioned on a similar principle. But for these types of radiators to work, you need a conducting material to take the heat away. In atmosphere, that conductor is air. In vacuum, there's almost nothing to conduct the heat away from the radiator, so when these S-foils open into an attack position, it does nothing to decrease heat, which then limits the X-Wing's performance. Why such an advanced ship obviously designed for space flight has this kind of design is kind of confusing. A pressurized liquid cooling system would be a better alternative. Liquids are much better conductors, and an internal fan can be built into the system that can function even in vacuum. Now the S-foils on the X-Wing might give it a more conventional airplane looking design and might even help it fly a little bit better in atmosphere by producing drag. But it's not really necessary for spaceflight unless aerodynamic craft like TIE fighters are still able to perform fine in atmosphere. So what could be the other reason an X-Wing has 4 S-foils that fan out so much? Well, the manufacturers say that it's to increase the spread of weapon fire. The X-Wing laser cannons are placed at the tip of each foil instead of mid-wing or in the nose of the fuselage. Early aircraft from World War I and World War II had machine guns and cannons that were placed on the wings in order to avoid the arc of the propeller. Some guns were mounted centerline but had to use a synchronizer mechanism or even a shield to fire through the prop. The synchronizer mechanism would limit the rate of fire of the machine guns, which also was a problem in itself. Now the problem with guns on the wings placed so far from each other was that it made aiming quite hard. The guns had to be calibrated to create a point of convergence, where all the guns on the wings intersected for maximum effect. This convergence point could vary greatly and really depended on the pilot's preference. Without any propellers on the X-Wing, the only reason you would need wing struts to mount guns is that you've run out of space on the nose of the aircraft. Even then, you want purposely put the lasers as far as possible from each other on the edges of the wing to increase spread. That's actually the opposite of what you want to do and makes no sense whatsoever in this scenario, especially because X-Wing laser cannons can't fire off-board. So we've determined that the S-foils are unnecessary for cooling and also weapon placement, so all they really do is increase the size of the profile of the ship.
Lock S-foils in attack position.
This makes it an easier target for the enemy. The wings also add additional weight to the starfighter, and the additional surface area might create problems for the craft upon entering atmosphere. And the Rebellion wasn't necessarily known for having the largest hangars in their ships. The additional wings also increased the amount of parts and maintenance that needed to be done for the vehicle. Now, the one good reason for having such large wing struts would be to mount additional weapon systems onto them. But for some reason, the X-Wing was designed to carry only 2 proton torpedoes on top of its 4 laser cannons. During the Galactic Civil War, the Empire had all control over the production and sales of these types of weapons, so it was relatively hard to get them unless you were looking on the black market. But still, it makes no sense why the X-Wing is designed to only hold 2 of these. If we take a look at the F-35, not only does it have 4 25mm cannons, it also has over 10 weapons points capable of carrying a variety of missiles and bombs. 4 wings should be able to carry a lot more than just 2 proton torpedoes. Especially when you look at Rebel fleet doctrine, which heavily focuses on snub fighters to counter large capital ships. You're going to need more than 2 torpedoes to do a lot of damage against a Star Destroyer. The X-Wing's cockpit is also poorly designed when it comes to close-range dogfights like the ones that Rebel pilots and Imperial pilots usually got into. In this type of line-of-sight combat, being able to see all around you is quite important. We mentioned this in one of our recent videos about Star Wars dogfights, but here it is again. The P-51 Mustang, one of the most successful American fighters, experienced some redesigns in its cockpit as the war went on and pilot feedback reached the designers. We go from having the rear completely obstructed to having a full bubble canopy. The same thing happened with the P-47 Thunderbolt. Other ships definitely had worse designed cockpits like the TIE Fighter, but the X-Wing's rear is still relatively obstructed. And while we're on the matter, why does the X-Wing even have windows in the first place? This extremely advanced starfighter, which can travel in hyperspace, should be able to have external sensors or cameras that link right to the pilot's helmet and give them a 360 view of the space around them. Our military now is already incorporating these kind of technologies into our own airplane systems. This would allow the X-Wing to have a completely enclosed cockpit without any window surfaces, making it a lot more sturdy for space combat. One of the major advantages the X-Wing had over the TIE Fighter was its ability to travel in hyperspace. This meant a wing of Rebel snubfighters could drop into a system, quickly carry out an attack against an Imperial ship before they were able to scramble their defenses, and then escape back into hyperspace. The X-Wing was fine for shorter hyperspace jumps, but for longer missions that could potentially take several hours or even days, the trip was tough for the pilot. The cockpit simply wasn't designed for long-term occupation. Luke Skywalker actually mentions this in the Star Wars novels and comics, and he would use Jedi meditation to overcome the boredom and discomfort of being trapped in such a tiny cockpit for long durations. Now, the X-Wing was definitely full of a lot of features, including a life support, hyperdrive, shields, and secondary weapon systems. But because it had so many different systems in it, the starfighter needed an astromech to manage all of these subsystems, adjust power consumption, and maximize efficiency of the craft in general. The astromechs were also needed for calculating hyperspace jumps. This once again increases the cost of the X-Wing and means without a proper astromech to support it, the X-Wing would not be able to perform at 100%. The cheaper and much simpler TIE Fighter didn't really have this problem. By the end of the Clone Wars, Incom Corporations was one of the premier starfighter producers in the galaxy. They were responsible for both the Z-95 Headhunter and ARC-170 starfighter. By the time the Galactic Republic turned into the Empire, Incom was in the process of finishing designs for the T-65B X-Wing. Palpatine's goals to nationalize the military-industrial complex included taking over Incom as well. Many of Incom's lead designers and engineers resigned in protest, and then somehow the designs for the T-65 X-Wing reached Rebellion hands. I'm sure these two things are unrelated. Anyway, the Rebellion started manufacturing the X-Wing for themselves, so the X-Wing was very much as grassroots as the entire Rebellion was. This meant no tech support, no mass production lines. The Rebellion had to manufacture the X-Wing in complete secrecy. I'm honestly very surprised that the Rebellion was even able to maintain such a large fleet of X-Wings in the first place. The X-Wing was a jack of all trades and master of none. It was an interceptor, a long-range reconnaissance craft, and could also do ground attack missions. But it never really excelled in anything. The Rebellion lacked the resources to field a larger, more diverse group of fighters and had to rely on multi-purpose craft like the X-Wing. It made sense logistically. Everything from maintenance to training was just easier when you had one platform. But when the X-Wing faced anything other than the base TIE Fighter, it found itself outmatched, especially because the Empire had a better training pipeline for its pilots. Also, because Incom was not available to give the Rebellion active support, they weren't able to upgrade their ship to be able to compete with more capable Imperial starfighters like the TIE Defender. So guys, there you have it. We were able to find 10 flaws with the X-Wing. A lot of it has to do with the basic design, mainly focusing on the S-foil. First made famous in The Empire Strikes Back, the AT-AT, or All-Terrain Armored Transport, was one of the most feared ground vehicles in the Imperial Army. But then again, it doesn't take much to scare a disorganized rabble of moisture farmers and bantha lovers. A direct descendant of the Republic all-terrain tactical enforcer, the AT-AT, like many Imperial designs, were focused on intimidation and pure power. The AT-AT's towering frame commanded most battlefields. It was heavily armored against most small arms fire, and its raised height also gave them additional protection from landmines and IEDs. The design of the AT-AT was a departure from the AT-AT's more practical approach. This large vessel was all about shock and awe. And while it performed well against frightened civilians and bandits, when the Rebel Alliance began forming a real resistance, the AT-AT's flaws began surfacing.
Will you look at the size of those things? Huh. Reinforced armor plating, heavy cannons, and anti-personnel blasters.
The AT-AT was 20 meters long and 22.5 meters high, which is about as tall as a 7-story building. We're not really sure how much an AT-AT weighs, but a cannon source says that it has a carrying capacity of 3,500 metric tons, which makes no sense. Converted to standard, that's almost 8 million pounds, and that is a real legitimate conversion. We're not making that up. 8 million pounds is about the weight of 60 M1A1 battle tanks. So I'm just going to write that off as some typical Star Wars nonsense. But what we do know is that the AT-AT is notorious for having problems on uneven ground and soft surfaces like deep mud due to its heavy weight and high center of gravity. So for an all-terrain vehicle, it definitely is lacking in performance. Just like all those stupid crossovers in the automobile market. Let's stop lying to ourselves, people. A CR-V is just a raised Honda Civic and nothing more. Anyway, the whole point of putting gigantic legs on an AT-AT is so that it can walk over obstacles that traditional wheels or treads couldn't get over. But when you scale up the design to such a massive size, any kind of benefits that you would get are negated. Forget sandy areas, not a stable enough foundation. Forget urban areas, you'll rip up all the roads and destroy the bridges. In Legends, during the assault on Echo Base on Hoth, several AT-ATs were launched before they even began their mission due to the unstable snowy ground. All that armor and the untraditional locomotion makes the Walker extremely slow. In an ideal situation, meaning flat hard ground, the AT-AT could hit a top speed of 60 kilometers per hour or just under 40 miles per hour. And let's be honest, most of the time it's operating not even close to its top speed. This is unacceptable for a vehicle that is designed to transport troops. For one, it's considerably slower than other vehicles in the Imperial Army pool and needs to be carried around by Gazanti cruisers for longer distance travel. And when the AT-AT is used for an assault, it's painfully slow compared to alternative transports like Imperial shuttles or Imperial troop transports. In our own world, firepower trumps any kind of defensive measure that we can invent. There's always going to be a more powerful round that can get through the body armor that you just built. There's always going to be a missile system that can overwhelm that reactive armor you created. Hackers will always be able to unhack your most secure systems. In Star Wars, defensive technology is far more advanced than anything we have here on Earth, but still the best defense is not getting hit in the first place. Just ask any soldier who wears a plate carrier into battle. Those ceramic plates are for a last resort situation when things get seriously screwed up. The average soldier would much rather not get shot in the first place. That's why some soldiers choose to reduce the weight of their kit to give them increased mobility on the battlefield. This same principle should be applied to armored vehicles, especially ones as vulnerable as the AT-AT. Its impressive height just screams, hit me with air support or an orbital turbo laser. Now, in the earlier years of the Galactic Civil War, the AT-AT was mostly going up against inexperienced rebel troops. As the rebellion became better trained and equipped, they also figured out how to take down an AT-AT. Even the impressive armor of an AT-AT couldn't withstand the firepower of a well-equipped ground force or naval force. Now, if you look at it closely, the AT-AT actually reminds me of one of those large Gungan beasts of burden used during the Battle of Naboo. Notice what it's carrying on its back, a shield generator. The AT-AT is definitely large enough to fit one of these. After all, it should be able to carry 8 million pounds on its back. With a theater shield installed on top of an AT-AT, it would not only be protected from artillery and air support, it would also offer protection to friendly troops nearby. If the AT-AT is really designed for troop transportation, it should have the smallest profile possible in order to avoid detection and attention. But the AT-AT does the opposite with its 22.5 meter height. Now, having an armored vehicle tip over because of a blast or uneven terrain is dangerous enough for the occupants of a vehicle, but placing that vehicle 7 stories in the air is just adding more unnecessary danger to the situation, especially if you look at how easy it is to topple the AT-AT. When a person falls from 22.5 meters high, they're traveling at a speed of 75 kilometers per hour or 46 miles per hour when they hit the ground. That is not a survivable speed, especially if you're not in a crash seat or have a seatbelt on. The height of the vehicle makes what should be a disabling shot turn into a fatal accident for the entire crew. And actually, at this height, I would even recommend adding ejection seats to the cockpit of this machine.
How many legs they got? Looks like 4. 4? How are they not falling over?
The AT-AT's legs were vital to the movement of the vehicle, yet they were relatively weak compared to the rest of the structure. They had weak joints at the knees, which could be taken out by something as low-powered as a repeating blaster. These legs also weren't powerful enough to power through Durasteel cable being wrapped around them like a lasso. As we mentioned, the legs limited the speed of the AT-AT without really giving it any advantages on different types of terrain. And unlike the AT-TE, they were extremely high off the ground, and all it took was damage to one leg for the entire unit to topple. The AT-TE was much lower to the ground and had 6 legs, which gave it a level of redundancy that the AT-AT sorely lacked. Because of the AT-AT's massive weight, the legs routinely needed a lot of maintenance, and massive machinery was needed to lift the weight off the legs for the mechanics to work on them. You couldn't really just fix an AT-AT in the field. Due to the AT-AT's tendency to become a bullet sponge in the middle of a battle because of its immense size, mechanics had to do a thorough analysis of the internal structure of the legs so that they wouldn't collapse on their next mission. The cockpit of the AT-AT stretched out from the rest of the vehicle on a neck joint that allowed the cockpit to turn from one side to another, which just seems like an unnecessary design choice. If you are going to make the cockpit protrude out of the rest of the body, at least don't make it as vulnerable by putting it on a movable joint. The AT-AT's neck joint was widely known as one of the most vulnerable spots on the machine. If you look at modern tanks, or even not so modern tanks, the idea was to always keep the crew within the vehicle behind as much metal and protection as possible. This usually meant the center of the tank. It makes no sense to create a structure that juts out in front of the rest of the vehicle. It presents an obvious target for the enemy. I mean, even if you are a completely primitive society, if you look at an AT-AT, you will know that it resembles a gigantic beast, and you'll most likely try to attack its head and neck area because that's just common sense. Also, we talked about this before with the X-Wing. The AT-AT could have easily been outfitted with sensors and cameras and have a completely closed-off hull. Modern militaries are actually using this technology as we speak. The only reason you would create a cockpit that is on an articulating neck would be if the lasers on your cockpit are fixed in location. But again, why use fixed blasters on a head that can only turn a few degrees? If someone were to attack the AT-AT from the rear or side, the entire vehicle would have to turn around, and that would take a considerable amount of time with something as large as an AT-AT, which also used legs instead of treads. Most modern tanks and armored transports use turrets for that reason. It gives the crew the ability to quickly get a fix on a target without having to move the vehicle as well. The AT-AT has a huge blind spot directly beneath its belly. As far as we can see, there's no way for the crew of the AT-AT to protect this area. That's how one Jedi is able to walk right up to the bottom of the AT-AT, climb up it, and then plant some explosives underneath it, destroying it.
Oh my God, it's pregnant! We're in a war! We're in a war!
In our own world, armor commanders know that a tank that isn't supported by infantry is incredibly vulnerable. The first tank charges of World War I were carried out by the British in land ships during the Battle of the Somme. The Mark I tanks immediately crashed through German lines and outpaced the infantry. Although many of these land ships broke down or ran out of gas, others were surrounded by infantry and destroyed with explosives because they lacked mechanized infantry support. Nowadays, heavy armor, especially in urban areas, would never be used without infantry to protect their vulnerable flanks and rear. Although some AT-ATs were deployed with mechanized infantry, most of the time they weren't. The AT-AT is too slow, too heavy, and too tall to be a successful transport or a successful assault vehicle. The only true advantage in its design is that it offers the commander of the vehicle a wide view of the surrounding battlefield. Now, if we incorporated that shield we talked about before, the AT-AT would actually make an excellent command and communication platform. It's perfectly set up, like we said. It's extremely tall, it has a good view of the surrounding area, and also gives clear access for communications. It also has a large rear compartment that can hold speeders for messengers or additional headquarters staff. It's a massive vehicle and can even be used as a geological landmark for friendly troops across the battlefield. In my opinion, that's the best use for a vehicle that's designed in this way. Of course, the First Order thought otherwise and just made a bigger version of the AT-AT Walker, which is just so creative. I'm usually not a huge fan of the aesthetics of the Separatist droid army, whether it's their large dreadnoughts or the B-1 battle droid. But ever since I saw the hover tank in Episode 1 Phantom Menace being used by the Trade Federation, I fell in love with the look and design of this vehicle. It's an awesome combination of clean lines and aggressive firepower. What's there not to like? Well, apparently a lot. Like the AT-AT, the AAT uses an alternative form of locomotion. Instead of wheels or tracks, the Separatist hover tank uses powerful repulsors to keep it floating above the ground. Repulsor technology is extremely advanced in the Star Wars universe and able to propel a wide variety of ground, air, and even space vehicles. It's relatively stable and reliable technology that can lift the AAT's mass off the ground, along with 500 kilos of cargo weight. We're not given the exact weight of the vehicle, but it's probably quite heavy because the AAT tops out at only 55 kilometers, which is slower than the massive AT-AT, which uses legs to move at a top speed of 60 kilometers. This makes no sense though. The repulsors are supposed to suspend the weight of the vehicle above the ground. We're not really sure how this works, there's no information in canon, but in Legends they claim that repulsors are powered by refined subnuclear knots of spacetime, which sounds like a bunch of space magic to me. But they do refer to the technology as anti-gravity several times and note that the repulsors only work when in proximity of a gravity well, like a planet or a star. So however they work, repulsors make the AAT weightless. There's no contact between the vehicle and the ground, so no friction is there to resist movement. Therefore, its speed should only be limited by the power of the vehicle's thrust and friction from air resistance. While I can imagine it takes a lot of energy to get something as large as an AAT moving and to stop it, but it should be able to hit a sustained speed well over 55 kilometers per hour. By the way, 55 kilometers per hour is around 32 miles per hour. In comparison, one of the fastest non-human Jedis, Usain Bolt, can hit a top speed of 28 miles per hour for a short period of time. As we talked about endlessly in our last video about the AT-AT Walkers, speed and maneuverability is still incredibly important on the Star Wars battlefield. Even the best shields and armor can eventually be worn down, so it's better not to test them at all in the first place. Now we know that the AAT is extremely slow and heavy, but that weight doesn't necessarily mean the hover tank is heavily armored. We've seen time and time again a hover tank can easily be taken out by a shoulder-launched missile like the Plex. The AAT did incorporate sloping armor, which generally is more effective against kinetic rounds, but I think the entire profile of the tank is a little bit too high. It could have been made with a much lower profile, in my opinion, making it harder to hit. Here's how an AAT would look like next to a more modern Earth-designed tank. The AAT was also extremely vulnerable to explosives placed underneath the tank and also towards the rear where all the more important components of the tank were placed. As reliable as repulsor technology was, there was no redundant system for the AAT if the repulsor generator was knocked out by a well-timed shot to the rear of the vehicle, or if the AAT drove over a landmine. EMP pulse weapons also disabled the vehicle, making them collapse to the ground. And once these repulsors were disabled, the tanks were basically impossible to move, unlike wheeled vehicles which could be towed by another vehicle. Now, it's unknown how high the repulsors can lift the vehicle. Lighter vehicles like speeders can essentially fly with their repulsors dialed to the right setting. The AAT's repulsors don't seem to have this kind of capability for some reason, which makes it unable to tackle uneven ground or more off-road surfaces. Another unexpected consequence of having a repulsor lift as your main propulsion system is that it can't drive through a deflector shield. Again, we're not given the reason why this happens, but I'm guessing it's because deflector shields usually contain ray and particle shields, which can block both physical objects and also particles. It's possible whatever the deflector shields can block will also block the anti-gravity measures of a repulsor lift. This is a huge oversight in design by the Separatist droid army, because many large conventional battles in the Star Wars galaxy will include theater shields or even planetary shields. While wheeled vehicles, walkers, and ground units can slowly pass through these shields, these hover tanks will have to be transported in by another means, and they'll have to have the repulsors completely turned off in order to pass through a shield. In some cases, they'll just have to wait outside the shield until infantry units are able to take down the generators. This wouldn't have been such a big deal if the AAT wasn't the Separatists' main assault tank and armed for that exact purpose. No matter how powerful your gun might be, if you can't make it to the battle, you're pretty much useless. The Separatist droid army was made up of 100% droids. Occasionally you'll have an organic or half-organic commander, and special forces might also be organic, but there was basically no reason to design organic interfaces for all of your vehicles and technology. Some designs in the CIS reflected the mechanical nature of their military, like the droid fighters or the IG-227 Hailfire class droid tank. You know what makes the Hailfire class such a great vehicle? Besides the barrage of homing missiles it has and the wheel propulsion system that allows it to move incredibly fast, if the Hailfire is ever knocked out, no clone trooper can go into it and commandeer it and then turn it against the Separatist army. That's because the Hailfire class didn't have a cockpit or any interface for organics. And because it didn't have these unnecessary compartments, it made the vehicle lighter, smaller, and much faster. The AAT, for some reason, was designed for an organic crew with fully laid out control surfaces with mechanical levers, buttons, and switches. This is a tank designed for a droid army that only uses droids. Droids that can interface with a vehicle without any physical controls. And not only are there controls for organics in the AAT, it also requires a crew of 4 droids to fully operate. This creates an open space within the AAT, which makes it larger and heavier, and that open space could have been used for armor or something more important like a shield generator. The crew consists of 2 gunners, a driver, and a commander. All these tasks should be able to be handled by just one computer brain. After all, the Hailfire class droid can maneuver, shoot, command itself all at the same time with no problem. There's only one reason why they want to design the AAT in this way, and that's because they want to sell it to organic armies. But even then, automating the AAT tank by placing an advanced droid brain in it couldn't be that hard. After all, the AAT had been used more than a decade before the Clone Wars even started. There was plenty of time to adapt to a new system. You're probably better off taking the tank crew and assigning them to protect the blind spots of the AAT. Like the AT-AT, the AAT was commonly deployed without any infantry support, leading to its eventual destruction. Countless Separatist tanks were destroyed by infantry units climbing up the tank and then dropping EMP grenades or detonators down into the commander and driver hatches, which should have been locked in the first place. I mean, in World War II, American tankers on the Western Front typically didn't lock their hatches unless they were completely overrun. That was because they had infantry support, and generally German soldiers couldn't get that close to the tank. But then again, they didn't have dickhead Jedi running around the battlefield with magical powers distributing detonators to tank crews. But it wasn't just the Jedi with their supernatural powers doing this, it was also the clone troopers and your average resistance fighter. And that was not only because of the lack of infantry support, but because of the massive blind spots around the vehicle, especially in the rear. Once again, we asked the same question we asked in our last episode with the AT-AT and also with the X-Wing. Why can't they have some kind of external sensor or hollow recorder that gives the crew inside a 360 view of its surroundings? This is Star Wars. They are much more advanced than our own society, yet our militaries are already testing AR systems as we speak for armored vehicles. And although the AAT did have anti-personnel lasers on it, they were fixed in a forward position. The AAT's main cannon was a beast. It was able to easily take out Republic ATTEs with a few well-placed shots. One of the problems with this weapon though was its massive recoil. Because the AAT wasn't rooted to the ground, it lacked the stability of a traditional firing platform. And that's even more confusing because the AAT was occasionally used as an artillery weapon both for direct and indirect fire, and without any locking mechanism to secure the vehicle, it had accuracy issues, especially when firing multiple rounds at the same location. Unlike traditional energy weapons, the AAT's main cannon also functioned like a kinetic energy one. The AAT was actually equipped with shells that were encased in plasma. The claims are that the metal shell helped increase penetration of the round and reduce the friction, increasing speed. Now, the penetration reason makes sense, but I'm not so sure about the friction idea and the increase in speed, although we do know that plasma rounds typically dissipate the longer they travel because the plasma cools down. Now, if there is a conductor like metal, which is able to surround the plasma, or the plasma surrounds the metal, I guess it can use as a conducting material to maintain its form for a longer period of time. There are also different types of shells, from bunker busters to high explosives to anti-personnel, and even a special tank that fired defoliator rounds. Although I agree there are some advantages to having actual shells fire out of your cannon, the main problem is now that the tank has to carry a large amount of ammunition, which definitely increases the weight of your vehicle and limits how many shots you can fire, opposed to a Tabana gas-powered laser cannon. The AAT could only carry 57 rounds before it needed to be reloaded. With a Tabana gas laser cannon, your main concern is overheating rather than running out of gas. The shells also depended on an autoloader system, which was just another component that could break down. Also, all the shells were located at the bottom of the tank, which also is where the armor was the thinnest, making a small landmine detonation turn into a massive explosion. So while the cannon's power was impressive, it also had some major design flaws which limited the effectiveness of an AAT. Another option that could either replace or at least supplement the AAT's firepower would be missile launchers, like the ones we see on the Hailfire droid. The Separatists were known for their advanced missile technology and used it very successfully against the Republic. These weapons were typically guided, had a much longer range than traditional energy weapons, and had more explosive damage. The only problem was they were quite expensive and took a lot of space. They also could be stopped by countermeasures, but typically only starfighters and larger starships had countermeasures. While some AATs were outfitted with dumb rockets, imagine how much damage they could do with a few long-range missiles that functioned beyond line of sight. The Republic heavily depended on line-of-sight weapons. An AAT could destroy several walkers before they got even close to them with a long-range missile system. And if they had a Tabana gas laser cannon system, they could replace those shells with missiles instead. Now, my last complaint with the Separatist AAT is its turret. It hardly ever seems to turn. It seems like it has the capability to slightly turn, but only when the vehicle is not moving. I might be wrong, but it's really hard to find footage or information on how much the turret actually moves. Also, because it's located at the rear of the vehicle, it can't decline the barrel that much, making a huge blind spot in front of the tank. Now, according to my research, George Lucas originally wanted the AAT to be more like a heavily armored assault chopper, or a flying tank similar to the Hind. You can kind of still see some resemblance in its design. This might explain why the hull kind of extends upwards so much, allowing the pilot and gunner to sit at staggered heights so that they can both have a clear line of sight, even though the Separatist tank doesn't even have any viewports. The stubby arms on the side of the tank that carries additional weapons also is very reminiscent of an assault chopper. And then there's adding a repulsor lift to the tank, which is another helicopter-like quality. That's probably why the AAT is also so visually appealing to me. It just looks like a giant bird of prey. But as a main battle tank, it just isn't well designed as, say, the Republic's own hover tank, TX-130 Sabre class. Well guys, you probably watched our last video where we broke down the 10 flaws of the AT-AT. If not, we'll link it in the corner somewhere around here with a card. I want to know in the comment section below which tank you think is better, the Walker from last time or the Separatist hover tank. The ARC-170 has always been one of my favorite ships in Star Wars. Admittedly, upon first glance, I thought it was an ugly duckling, but the design grew on me, especially when I started noticing how much it resembled one of my favorite real-world aircraft, the A-10 Thunderbolt, aka the Warthog. I love the sound of Brat in the morning. Now, every part of me wanted to do a video about how awesome the ARC-170 is and how it's the best medium starfighter in Star Wars. But it simply isn't. It has some major design flaws, and it also doesn't really fit the type of role it's designed for, and that's a pity because this is a great looking starfighter and it actually does have a lot of potential. Oh, and one more thing, because of the general lack of video for the ARC-170, we'll be using a lot of Battlefront 2 game footage. I apologize beforehand about my piloting skills. Had I been alive during World War II, I probably would have been volunteered into a kamikaze squadron. I think most people don't realize how large starfighters in Star Wars actually are, especially the ARC-170. A lot of that has to do with the fact that most of the time when we see starfighters, it's usually against the backdrop of the vastness of space or some epic battle featuring huge capital ships that also dwarfs it in size. But if we take something like the ARC-170 and put it next to something a bit more familiar, say like a school bus, we begin to see exactly how large it is. At 12.71 meters long, the ARC-170 was just as long as your average school bus, and with an enormous wingspan of 19.85 meters, it would almost be as wide as a 6-lane highway. In my opinion, that makes ARC-170 way too large to just be a simple fighter. As a matter of fact, if we put the ARC-170 next to the F-22 Raptor, one of the larger birds in our Air Force, we begin to realize just how unnecessarily large these ships are. And then perhaps the most important size comparison is just how small the ARC-170's main enemies are, the Vulture droid and the even smaller but deadlier droid Tri-Fighters. It comes to no surprise that when these small, cheaper droid fighters encounter the ARC-170, they usually won with their superior speed and maneuverability. And although the ARC-170 is classified as a long-range reconnaissance fighter, it was commonly used as a space superiority fighter and escort fighter. These were jobs that this fighter was ill-equipped to do because of its large size and lack of maneuverability. What made it worse, every time one of those cheap droid fighters took out one of these expensive ARC-170s, it also potentially killed the entire crew of 3. For some reason, the ARC-170 not only had a pilot, but also a co-pilot, rear gunner, and even an astromech. First, let's look at the rear gunner. In defense of the ARC-170, Star Wars space combat is usually fought at close ranges with unguided line-of-sight munitions. This isn't all that different from the type of combat we see in World War I, II, and to a lesser extent, in the Korean War and even the Vietnam War. And while bombers kept rear-facing guns all the way through the Cold War, fighter aircraft long ago abandoned this practice. For one, most engagements during the jet fighter age took place with missiles at longer ranges. Also, as aircraft became faster and more maneuverable, it became tougher and tougher to calculate bullet trajectory and hit enemy targets while moving so fast and twisting and turning all at the same time. Starfighters in Star Wars fly in open space where there isn't air resistance or gravity wells affecting flight speed. They also had advanced inertial dampeners to decrease the effect of gravity on crews, so these ships were capable of flying at much faster speeds, but also they were much more agile than even modern jet fighters, which consequently makes it even tougher for a rear gunner to hit anything at all. On top of that, laser cannons fired projectiles that are slower than the gunpowder weapons we use here on Earth, making things even more complicated. If you take a look at our own world, in World War II, most fighters had already abandoned using a rear gun and focused on maneuverability and speed over more rear-facing firepower. And without a rear turret and gunner, the aircraft also became smaller and lighter. As a matter of fact, the Republic Alliance famously took Republic-era Y-wings and removed the rear turrets and gunners for the same reason. As a long-range reconnaissance starfighter, I can assume that the ARC-170 is probably designed for longer missions. This is why the ARC-170 could hold enough rations for the entire crew for 3 to 5 days. Another redundancy measure the ARC-170 had was having a second pilot who sat between the pilot and gunner. This individual took over piloting if the main pilot was asleep so that, he didn't accidentally fall asleep behind the controls and fly them into a black hole or an asteroid. The co-pilot also had control over the forward-facing guns. Now, having your co-pilot arm and fire missiles is common practice. In our own Air Force, co-pilots are oftentimes referred to as weapons officers on dual-seat aircraft. Now, in this case, the co-pilot not only controls the proton torpedoes, but also the forward-facing lasers, which in my opinion should be controlled by the pilot, who is more able to adapt to the movements of the ship. More importantly, for a recon ship, it would be more beneficial for the co-pilot to handle scanners and communications rather than just the weapon systems alone. But strangely enough, there's no mentioning of this role on the aircraft, and there's hardly any information about the scanner package on this ship. Now, what really makes the additional crew members unnecessary is the fact that there's an astromech bolted onto the back of the ship. With astromechs like R2-D2 and BB-8, these little robots are fully alive and intelligent AI beings. And in some ways, they're even more human than this robot trying to hit on Padme.
The closer I get to you, the worse it gets. The thought of not being with you, I can't breathe.
Now, the main reason that snowfighters have astromechs is for their advanced navigation and calculation abilities. It takes a tremendous amount of calculations and detailed star charts to properly calculate these jumps, otherwise you risk flying into a gravity well and having your flight plan delayed or even worse. Most nav computers could have a few preset courses, but in order to make on-the-fly calculations, you really need a droid. Droids were also great co-pilots. They could manage the energy usage for all the systems on board, making sure the craft ran at maximum efficiency. They could also run diagnostics to find out problems on board and even potentially repair them. They could also use scanners and help with the communication process. Some astromechs like R2-D2 could even pilot the ship themselves and help fire the weapons. And an astromech is tiny and doesn't require too much additional space or creature comforts. It doesn't even need to eat or drink or go to the bathroom. I mean, look at the entire Separatist Navy, it's all droids. So having an astromech on top of a 3-man crew is just completely a waste. The ARC-170 is equipped with a decent hyperdrive rated at 1.5. In comparison, the Millennium Falcon, widely known as one of the fastest ships in the galaxy, had a Class 0.5 hyperdrive. Now, while the ARC-170 hyperdrive was pretty decent, especially compared to civilian ships, it actually wasn't really all that great when compared to other military hardware. To take a look at the Separatist Navy, their droid fighters were all battery powered and had limited range and no hyperdrives, but ships like the Separatist Providence class Dreadnought had a Class 1.5 hyperdrive as well, which could easily keep up with the ARC-170 in hyperspace, which kind of completely defeats the purpose of a recon ship. The recon fighter should be able to outpace a larger Separatist capital ship in case it jams its communications, and the ARC-170 needs to jump back to friendly space in order to give a physical report. Now, during the Galactic Civil War, only a few years later, both sides equipped 1.0 class hyperdrive, including the successor of the ARC-170, the Incom X-Wing. Another really odd design choice for the ARC-170 was the fact that it had extremely heavy lasers on its wingtips. I mean, look at just how ridiculously large these things are. These lasers were reportedly heavy enough to even pierce capital ship armor, making the ARC-170 perhaps accidentally a great strike fighter. This is also where the aggressive recon comes from. The problem with this kind of heavier laser is that it consumes a larger amount of energy and produces a larger amount of heat, which means it can overheat quite quickly. So most of the time, these lasers had governors on them to prevent overheating and even damage to the system. That meant these larger lasers had slower firing rates, which is actually quite a handicap in a dogfight. And for some reason, the ARC-170 just had these two giant lasers. It didn't have any additional smaller and more rapid firing laser cannons. On top of that, like the X-Wing, the ARC-170's lasers are on the wingtip, which means the pilot had to calibrate a point of convergence in order to hit objects, further complicating the whole firing process. So the ARC-170 was a huge aircraft. It's almost the size of a gunboat, really. And this made it not only easier to hit in a line-of-sight dogfight, but it also made it easier to spot on scanners. The ship also had massive heatsink radiators and foils on the wings due to its heavy laser, which increased its thermal footprint. These are opposite of the type of traits you would want on a reconnaissance craft. Recon aircraft here on Earth focus heavily on stealth capabilities, high altitude, and high-speed performance to stay out of reach of enemy fighters and missiles. The ARC-170, on the other hand, was just a flying tank, but more on that later. So as we mentioned before, larger lasers meant a bigger cooling system. Like the X-Wing, the ARC-170's entire wing structure was for cooling. You don't really need wings for spaceflight, and repulsors and inertial dampeners make lift unnecessary for in-atmosphere flights. Now, the problem with this radiator system is that there is no air in space, which means traditional heat sinks and radiators have a problem finding and conducting material to take away all that energy. If you look at the ISS, it uses an ammonia cooling system which leads heat away from essential systems into cooling fins that slowly radiates and dissipates the energy into space. The problem with the ARC-170's design is that the radiator and S-foils are located quite close to the center of the ship. A better position for S-foils would be on the tip of the wings, kind of like how the ETA Actis is designed. This pushes the heat out as far away from the rest of the craft as possible. This would also consequently put the lasers closer to the middle of the aircraft, ideally center aligned with the cockpit, making firing a lot easier. So the ARC in ARC-170 is short for aggressive recon, which kind of is a weird phrase. We're taught that reconnaissance is all about gathering as much information as possible, hopefully without being detected. That's why reconnaissance craft in general are usually small and operate in single or small units. The idea is the longer you can stay hidden, the more information you can gather. Aggressive reconnaissance almost evokes the idea of a skirmisher, a light unit designed to harass and poke enemy formations while looking for potential weaknesses. A great aggressive reconnaissance craft would be the Republic stealth ship used by Anakin against Admiral Trench. It had full cloaking measures and a large amount of proton torpedoes, which allowed it to make a quick strike and then go back into stealth mode. The ARC-170 was the opposite of stealthy, although it did have a lot of firepower. Now, my next question is, why are manned recon craft used in Star Wars at all? On our own planet, we have more or less phased out manned recon aircraft like the high-flying U-2 or Blackbird. We have satellites for strategic planning and smaller UAVs for tactical reconnaissance. The Star Wars universe is fully capable of creating similar drones, and the Empire was famous for using them to scout planets for hidden rebel bases. These unmanned scouts were extremely small and harder to detect, and more importantly, they were much cheaper, and they didn't endanger any living beings. Now you probably saw this next point coming from a mile away. The ARC-170 is not a reconnaissance craft. This designation is flawed and shows that the Republic military leaders misunderstood this craft's capabilities. Just like how Hitler wanted the Me-262 to function as a bomber for his revenge strikes, even though as a jet-powered fighter it was clearly more suited to be a high-speed interceptor. If we take reconnaissance out of the name ARC-170, we're only left with aggressive, and that's what the ARC-170 is. With its large capital ship laser cannons, rear gunner, co-pilot who functions as a weapons officer, slower speed, heavier armor and shields, and it's clearly an attack fighter. I mean, the thing even has giant cooling ducts for in-atmospheric flight, which is why it reminds us of the A-10 Warthog in the first place. The ARC-170 was really more of a fighter-bomber. Any craft slow enough to require a tail gunner and weapons officer better have the firepower to back up all that weight. Now, if we take a look at the ARC-170 using the parameters we would use for a fighter-bomber, now things are beginning to make a lot more sense. On the gigantic battlefields of Geonosis, an ARC-170 armed to the teeth could do some real damage against Separatist ground forces. So guys, that is our analysis of the ARC-170. Personally, one of my favorite ships in the Star Wars universe. I really do hope we get to see more of this craft. Hopefully we'll see it in the new season of Clone Wars, which is actually a deleted season that Dave Filoni is reviving. We do know that there is a major battle in this arc. So maybe we'll see the ARC-170 return to the battlefield, maybe making some ground attacks and shrugging off some laser blasts like a Warthog would. Created by Quad Systems Engineering, the ETA Actus II along with the V-Wing would serve as a template for future Imperial designs, specifically for the Senior Fleet Systems TIE Fighter in-space superiority craft. Compared to its successor, the ETA-II Actus was a pretty well-equipped starfighter which served as a bridge between Old Republic and Galactic Empire designs. The Republic prior to the Clone Wars had drawn on civilian soldiers, which meant that they put an emphasis on pilot survivability and safety. The Galactic Empire had an opposite philosophy, which started growing during the latter years of the Republic, as Chancellor Palpatine, who turned into the Emperor, started stripping away the last remaining traces of the Republic.
I love democracy.
Everything and everyone in the Empire was designed to serve the Emperor and his ambitions, and the TIE Fighter's poor and minimalistic design, which put little emphasis on pilot survivability, was an example of that. So the ETA Actus II is very much Palpatine and the Empire's first step towards a more minimalistic design. Today we're going to be breaking down this craft and looking at its flaws. The ETA Actus II was primarily designed to replace the Jedi Fighter, otherwise known as the Delta VII Ether Sprite. This was a very minimalistic craft designed specifically with the Jedi in mind. As a matter of fact, many essential systems and scanners were removed from the craft to save weight. What resulted was an extremely maneuverable and stripped-down starfighter that was difficult to pilot for individuals without the Force. The ETA Actus II built on this design and was even faster and more nimble than the Delta VII. The ETA Actus II was designed alongside the V-Wing and the ARC-170. The latter two designs were created for widespread use amongst the clone pilots. But because the ETA Actus II performed quite well in the hands of the Jedis, and more importantly because it was so small, 192 of these fighters would be equipped on each Venator-class Star Destroyer. Now, the ETA Actus II clone trooper variant usually didn't have astromechs and were less stripped-down versions than the Jedi ones. But because this craft was designed for Jedi pilots, meant the clone troopers couldn't utilize this craft to its fullest potential. One of the major steps backwards that the ETA Actus II took from the Ether Sprite design was that it lacked shields. As a matter of fact, a lot of Jedi pilots protested against the manufacturers for this exact reason. Although I can't prove it, I wouldn't be surprised if ultimately Palpatine was responsible for this design choice to increase Jedi casualties and make them easier to kill during Order 66. Some modified ETA Actus II craft would incorporate shields later on, but more or less this design would stay in place without proper defenses. When Senior Fleet Systems designed the TIE Fighter, it would incorporate the ETA Actus II's lack of shields, claiming that speed and maneuverability was better than being slow and protected. But the real reason they did this was more likely because it significantly decreased production costs and energy requirements. Interestingly enough, the other ship the TIE Fighter was based on, the V-Wing, did have shields, but ultimately the design that Senior Fleet Systems would incorporate from that ship was also one of its flaws, a lack of life support systems. Which I'm sure they explained by saying less air meant tougher pilots, but in reality this was also another cost reduction measure. While speed and maneuverability did keep pilots alive in large-scale space battles, even the best Jedi pilots couldn't account for shrapnel, stray laser fire, or even space debris and micrometeorites. Not having shields wouldn't have been as big of a deal if the ETA Actus II was heavily armored like, say, the ARC-170. The ARC-170 could actually shrug off a couple of laser blasts after its shields went down, and many of these resilient fighters made it back to the hangar with a few battle scars. The ETA Actus II was not only unshielded but also extremely lightly armored. This meant the pilot actually had a very small margin for error. This is why, again, the ETA Actus II was really more suited for Jedi pilots rather than clones. Now, the Separatist Alliance had a variety of missiles at their disposal, but perhaps no other weapon in the Separatist Alliance arsenal was more feared by Republic pilots than the Buzz Droid missile. These weapons deployed a cluster of tiny droids which clamped onto enemy starfighters and quickly using cutting tools to dismantle their hull and essential systems. This oftentimes led to the ship being disabled, or even worse, the cockpit venting into space, or the ship just exploding. There were very few defenses against Buzz droids, but the ETA Actus II was extremely vulnerable to these droids, not only because of their light armor, but because the radiator and foils on the wings were virtually uncovered to allow better thermal radiation. And because of the wide spread of the Buzz droid canisters, it was almost impossible to avoid them. So even talented pilots like Anakin and Obi-Wan Kenobi couldn't avoid getting caught in their range.
Watching and learning, Padawan. Uh-oh.
R2, what's going on over there?
Oh, that's not good.
One of the major reasons why the ETA Actus II was lighter and smaller than the Delta VII Ether Spire was because the front hull of the former design was removed, giving the ETA Actus II a split bow design. This left the front of the canopy unshielded from collisions from space debris and enemy fire. It also significantly weakened the structure of the ship. The Ether Sprite's triangular design was able to withstand much more pressure and stress. Now, one advantage the ETA Actus II did have over the Ether Sprite was that it had a full astromech socket. The Delta VII fuselage was way too thin and only special astromechs could work in its slot. It basically had one of those annoying micro USB ports instead of a full USB port. Now, one of the main reasons you would have an astromech on board was for calculating hyperspace jumps. But despite having an astromech droid built on board, the ETA Actus II was too small to incorporate a hyperdrive, limiting its range significantly. Which is probably why the ARC-170, one of the few Republic starfighters large enough to have a hyperdrive, was designed for a recon role, despite being poorly suited for the job. Because the ETA Actus II, the V-Wing, and the Torrent fighters all didn't have hyperdrives, it meant that the majority of the Venator-class Star Destroyer's 400-plus starfighters didn't have hyperspace capabilities. This severely limited the Venator's ability to carry out long-range offensive attacks, and because it lacked close-range firepower like later Star Destroyers would have, this was a huge problem. In order to allow starfighters to travel in hyperspace, the Venator-class Star Destroyer deployed a series of hyperspace rings. The ETA Actus II, when paired with the Silear 45 hyperspace drive, was rated as a Class 1.0 hyperdrive-capable vehicle, which was actually quite fast at the time. The problem was deploying the rings and storing them in the middle of combat was a complicated issue and just wasn't practical. The hyperspace rings would be discarded after use, serving as a very easy target for the enemy, so usually squadrons had to assign fighters to defend these rings so that ETA Actus II had a way to get back home. The ETA Actus II had 2 laser cannons but no concussion or proton torpedo launchers. This significantly limited the craft's ability to serve in an anti-capital ship role. Due to the Venator-class Star Destroyer's lack of turbo lasers, it depended on these smaller craft for more firepower. Without heavier weapons, the ETA Actus II had to get pretty creative in order to damage larger capital ships.
Oh, I have a bad feeling about this.
Most ETA-2 Actus pilots were just limited to chasing enemy starfighters. In place of proton torpedoes, the ETA Actus II had ion cannons for a secondary firing mode. The ion cannons were good for peacekeepers because they could disable civilian ships temporarily without destroying them. In combat, hitting the enemy with laser cannons was preferable. Although ion cannons were pretty useful against droids, They only deactivated them, while lasers permanently destroyed droids and didn't give them a chance to reboot. Also, ion cannons were widely inaccurate, especially at further ranges, and the smaller ion cannons like the ones on the ETA Actis were ineffective against larger capital ship shields. You need something significantly more powerful like an ion torpedo to damage a larger craft. Despite its minimal systems, the ETA Actis II still generated a considerable amount of thermal energy, which needed to be dispersed from the craft system in order to prevent it from overheating and getting permanently damaged. The S-foils on the ETA Actis II were put on the tips of the wings, which was the optimal location for heat dispersion away from the center of the craft. The problem was, even though the entire wing was basically a heat sink, the surface area was still too small to properly get rid of enough heat. It's the same problem smaller and thinner gaming laptops face, and one of the limiting factors in technology design in our own world. Smaller devices means less area to dissipate heat, which is why the latter TIE Fighter design would feature gigantic S-foils which were larger than the body of the craft. The Battle of Coruscant would ultimately determine the future in starfighter design. During the battle, the heavier and fully equipped ARC-170 suffered extremely high casualties when compared to the ETA Actis II. This would lead the Republic and ultimately Imperial designers to favor the more agile and less armored TIE Fighter design over something more well-rounded like the X-Wing. But I would argue the failures of the ARC-170 was due to that craft's specific design flaws, which we talked about in another video, you can check that out right here. And it was also due to the extremely small and agile enemy droid fighters it faced, rather than the ETA Actis II's superior design. Although the ETA Actis II performed better than the ARC-170 did against the droid fighters, it doesn't necessarily mean that unshielded starfighters are better than shielded ones. Unfortunately, Empire believed in this philosophy and chose wrong. Ultimately, the X-Wing, which in many ways was a lighter version of the ARC-170, would outperform the minimalistic TIE Fighter, which was the successor for the ETA Actis II. So, an update about my Jedi bathrobes. I talked to one of my Mandalorian hunter friends, and he actually told me that this is made out of genuine Ewok fur, and I gotta tell you guys, it is so soft and comfortable, which is just another reason why we should be domesticating Ewoks, because they have great meat, and now apparently they have great fur as well. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about the Grand Army of the Republic. The clones were amongst the best soldiers the galaxy had ever seen, but as I've said many times, had Palpy McScrotumface not been playing both sides of the war, the Republic would have lost the war against the Separatists within a year. Today we continue our 10 Flaws series by looking at everything the Grand Army of the Republic did wrong during the Clone Wars. We're not going to be specifically talking about the clones' fighting ability and their weaknesses too much. We looked in depth at their flaws and advantages on our other channel, Generation Films. You guys can check that out over here after you watch this video. The Republic Senate was a mess. Even the most nonpartisan issues got caught in a sticky web of bureaucratic political nonsense. Even as region after region seceded from the Republic, it still took the Senate over 2 years to pass the Military Creation Act, which overturned the millennia-old Rusan Reformation and allowed the Republic to finally field an army. The strange thing is, when one Jedi happens to accidentally stumble upon a secret world that has been hidden by some unknown conspiracy and finds an entire army that's been in production for over 10 years, the Republic Senate embraces this army without even batting an eye, or making one of those subcommittees that they love appointing themselves to. This was highly uncharacteristic for the Republic Senate. There should have been at least an official inquiry into how stable these clones were, or more importantly, shouldn't someone have asked who made them and for what reason, and where did the funding come from? All Obi-Wan Kenobi found out was Lost Jedi Sifo Dyas was responsible for placing the order. But how did a Jedi who was essentially a monk with no belongings raise all that money in secret? The Jedi Order is relatively rich, but had no part in helping fund this army. A quick investigation could have looked at Sifo Dyas' closest friends and contacts, including former Jedi Separatist leader Count Dooku. The intergalactic banking clans had not been nationalized by Palpatine yet, but they would still need to cooperate to a certain degree with the Senate investigation because they were a part of the Republic, and some of the key individuals in the investigation, like Sifo Dyas, was a Jedi who were technically employees of the Republic. Some digging would probably uncover a massive transfer in funds from Count Dooku to Sifo Dyas. If nothing is found, they could also check out the financial transitions to the Camino cloning facilities. Such an expensive project will have to have a money trail, and eventually will lead investigators to the source of who created this army. Uncharacteristically, the Republic Senate quickly passes the Military Creation Act without really understanding what the clones were. This was due to the discovery of a massive separatist army. The droid army that the Separatists fielded was huge in number compared to the Republic Judicial Forces and even the Grand Army of the Republic. This is due to cheap, low-quality droids the Separatists were using. While the CIS was much smaller in territory and population compared to the Republic, it was rich in raw resources in industrial worlds. They were able to quickly repurpose their entire manufacturing output to build and supply their military. The first batch of clones was already paid for, but much like a cheap printer, the low upfront costs oftentimes hid extremely expensive maintenance, aka ink costs. Not only did it take a considerably longer time to create a clone when compared to a droid, they also required a massive amount of resources to grow, train, and needed to be supplied on the battlefield and also have living quarters when they weren't fighting. While it took at least 9 years to fully train a clone, it took just minutes to create a B1 battle droid. And no matter how much better a clone is at fighting, he'll never be able to beat 100 droids. Now, I understand why the Republic needed an immediate reaction force to counter the Separatist droid army, but I don't understand why the Republic leaders didn't look at alternative soldiers to supplement their clone army. The one real advantage that the Republic had was its population. They greatly outnumbered the Separatist alliance. Maybe the Galactic Republic exists in a more enlightened period than our own, where citizens no longer need to fight in wars to defend their own homes. Maybe the senators realized that asking their constituents to fight would be political suicide. But I'm not talking about a draft, but maybe just asking for volunteers. I'm sure there are plenty of people who were patriotic enough to join, or just were looking for an adventure, or maybe a way to better their own lives through service. That, or I'm sure you could just go to the lower levels of Coruscant and press some sewer rats into service as cannon fodder. The point is, let's not pretend that life was not cheap in the Galactic Republic. Sure, you had the rich and powerful and the middle class who elected the Senate, but what about the vast amount of people living outside the system in impoverished conditions? To them, 3 square meals a day and some weapons training might be a step up in life. The Separatists were using battle droids. Well, they were really repurposed security droids. So why wasn't the Republic looking into supplementing their forces with machines as well? Again, extremely cheap and quick to produce, and like the clones, they had no rights and didn't vote, so it didn't really matter if a massive amount of them ended up getting destroyed. Now, I'm aware that many of the leading droid manufacturing companies of the Techno Union left the Republic to join the Separatists, but the Republic still had massive manufacturing capabilities, and many defense companies like Quat Engineering, Corellian Engineering, Blastech, and Arakid Industries. But instead of looking into creating a battle droid, they fielded costly weapons platforms like the ARC-170 Recon Fighter, which was not only extremely slow, but had 3 live clones on board, and these created easy targets for the much cheaper droid fighters. The whole point of the Ruusan Reformation was not to destroy the Republic's ability to defend itself, but to decentralize all military funding. This, in theory, would maintain the Republic's many regions' ability to protect itself while decreasing the chance of an all-out galactic war and oppression by the federal government. But of course, this only works on paper. In practice, things are a lot more tricky. Although funding was redirected to fund local defense forces, enforcement of how these funds were to be spent was lax. And over the year, galactic-wide peace and lack of conflict saw the funding that was originally slated for defense to be repurposed for other projects and ambitions. After 1,000 years of peace and stagnation, I'm sure most regions and planets either failed to meet their necessary defensive spending quotas or just plain got rid of them. This is why during the Clone Wars we rarely ever see any planetary defense forces, and the ones we usually do see are under-equipped and serving more as police forces rather than a proper military defensive unit. The Republic was at a huge disadvantage in this war. Not only were they outnumbered by the droid army, they also had a massive amount of territory to defend. Whenever they moved their small Grand Army of the Republic to one world, it left several other worlds wide open to attack. In the beginning of the war, the clones were far too few in number and way too expensive to really serve as frontline units. The first batch of clones numbered only 200,000, and many of them would go on to perish during the Battle of Geonosis due to terrible leadership from the Jedi, and another million clones were on the way. While that easily would outnumber most standing militaries on Earth today, on a galactic-wide scale, it was ridiculously low. That's why oftentimes the Republic was deploying battalions or even just company-sized units to try to claim entire worlds. These clone units would have been put to better use as advisors and trainers in foreign internal defense. Instead of trying to protect the millions of worlds in the Republic, the Senate could have started enforcing defense quotas on these worlds, which really was for their own benefit, especially now that the Separatist army was going around taking over systems. Placing the Jedi in high command positions during the Clone Wars was completely idiotic. The Jedi were excellent combatants, but had next to no experience leading troops into battle, and I'm sure very few understood logistics or strategic planning. As a matter of fact, on some occasions, the Jedi would even place children in command of military units, which, surprise, led to defeat. The Republic still had military academies scattered throughout its systems on more militarized worlds. They also had clones that were ready to be promoted internally to command positions. The clones weren't droids and were fully capable of leading their fellow clones into battle. They all had over 9 years of military training, which was far more than a Jedi had. On top of that, they didn't have any dogmatic religious views that could skew their judgment during combat. While parts of the Techno-Union did leave the Galactic Republic, the Trade Federation still stayed in the Senate, despite the fact that they were very obviously working directly with the Separatist Alliance to undermine the Republic's war effort. Isn't it weird that the Trade Federation security forces used during the Naboo crisis have a direct resemblance to the Separatist droid army? Even the tanks that they use are exactly the same. While the Republic probably didn't want to risk losing the Trade Federation, they should have at least posed sanctions and investigated potential ties between the Trade Federation and Separatists. I personally would have at least temporarily banned their representatives from the Senate and used other covert means to stop their meddling. The Separatist droid army had a really clear weakness that really wasn't exploited by the Republic until the latter years of the war. The entirety of their army was made from droids that were poorly shielded from EMPs and ion weapons. It wasn't until the Battle of Malastare that we actually see larger scale ion weapons being used. This is something that the GAR should have looked into right away. Ion weapons were already available to the wider galaxy and had the added benefit of not damaging organics. It also seemed like most GAR vehicles had decent shielding to EMP and ion weapons, so they could have just went crazy with these kind of weapons if they wanted to, especially when the clones are outnumbered. But instead, the clones fought the droids in conventional battles that very much favored the Separatist droid army. With their greater numbers, the Separatists were able to attack far more worlds than the GAR had the capability to defend. And so, in the beginning of the war, the clones were rushed from one battle to another without respite. A greater focus should have been placed on taking out key enemy commanders with special forces. The Separatist droid army was very much a top-down command structure. Without higher-level command droids or organic commanders, the Separatist army would have seen a great decrease in their efficiency. Although the droid army technically did have NCOs, they were hardly any different from your average rank-and-file battle droid, and their grasp of tactics was limited at best. This should have been the main job of the Jedi and other Republic special forces like the Clone Commandos. Killing off their commanders, the GAR would have had a much easier time slowing down the Separatist droid army and would have prevented them from fielding new army groups. And at the end of the war, the Separatist High Command surrendered and then issued a signal galaxy-wide that shut down most of the droids. It's surprising that the Republic wasn't able to figure out that the battle droids had this kill switch. They had access to endless amounts of battle droids on the battlefield and could have taken them apart to discover any weaknesses they might have had. Instead of just using conventional weapons to destroy the droid, they could have found the kill switch, or they could have developed viruses or figured out a way to jam the droid's communications. It just seems like a missed opportunity to not look at these alternative ways to fight droids. One of the reasons why looking at the ships in the sequel era is a bit harder is just the general lack of detail Disney has provided. Also, the lore hasn't been given enough time to age and refine into something that can be loved and pored over with a crazy attention to detail. One of the ships that I really want to talk about that comes from The Last Jedi is the MG-100 SF-17 Star Fortress. Admittedly, I've spent my fair share of time already on this channel making fun of the design choices and functionality of this pieced-together bomber. So obviously now it's time for us to piece together all these random thoughts and basically do a full-on 10 flaws video. Now, one of my biggest pet peeves with the MG-100 Star Fortress is the fact that its fuselage is vertically aligned and there's also gravity on the entire ship. This means the engineers and gunners on board had to literally climb a flight of ladders to access a large portion of the ship, something that crew members in the novel Cobalt Squadron actually complained about. It would be much easier and safer if that central passageway didn't have any gravity at all. This will allow the crew to pass easily through the center section of the ship and also make inspecting the payload much easier as well. Ships like the Star Fortress have a device known as the inertial dampeners. This creates a bubble of anti-gravity around the ship. They could adjust this machine to limit the gravity to just the cockpit. The Resistance is made up of veteran fighters, and a lot of the decision makers actually fought in the Galactic Civil War. You had leaders like Admiral Akbar, General Princess Leia, and Fighter Ace Wedge Antilles. They all knew exactly how to fight a larger, more powerful force, and that's with slash attack runs. While Rebel capital ships were always kinda meh, their starfighters and bombers were superb and, more importantly, nimble enough to carry out those slash and run attacks. That's why the Rebellion heavily used the A-Wing and the B-Wing bombers. So why such a big change in strategy and tactics when it comes to the Star Fortress? These heavy bombers weren't maneuverable at all, and worse yet, extremely slow. It also took a very long time to deploy them, and for a group like the Resistance, any prolonged fight will usually end up causing heavy casualties. It just seems like an odd ship choice for the organization. Even the venerable Y-Wing would have been a better choice, although it's very likely there were only a few left in the galaxy with intact fuselages. To make matters worse, shield coverage seemed to vary from one ship to another. Although most Star Fortresses had some kind of deflector shield at least covering the ball turret gunners. The ships did also have additional armor plating on them, but again, a bit too little and a bit too late in the middle of a dogfight. The B-17 Flying Fortress, which is what the Star Fortress is playing homage to, was known for absorbing crazy amounts of damage and still being able to make it back to base, sometimes with multiple engines knocked out and even chunks of the controls on the flaps and wings missing. But the SF-17 Star Fortress seems to lack this durability, but it is also just as slow. In order to compensate for the lack of speed and armor on these bombers, Resistance pilots were trained to fly in a tight formation in order to protect each other with their overlapping defensive fire. While this worked quite well again with bomber wings during World War II, the problem is the type of weapons they had in World War II on Earth are very different from the ones they have in Star Wars. The biggest large area damage weapons World War II pilots had to worry about was flak. The flak, while dangerous, was not as dangerous as individual German fighters, so they chose to stick together. But in Star Wars, you have massive ion cannons, giant turbo lasers, buzz droids, and all sorts of dangerous weapons that are very effective against bunched together targets. There is one advantage to flying close to one another, and that's the ability to overlap shields, but again, not all Star Fortresses had shields. And the overlapping field of fire would work better if there were more than just 2 gunners on each Star Fortress. Although these formations will be relatively protected from the rear, they'll also be very vulnerable from the top and the bottom. The Star Fortress could carry over 1,000 proton bombs or other munitions of the same size. This is probably the primary reason why the ship design is so strange and so slow. This is definitely a crazy amount of firepower, but really falls more in line with the Imperial First Order philosophy rather than the Resistance's. The First Order Navy could take a lot of punishment and then also dish out a lot of punishment, whereas the Resistance usually depended on precision strikes and quick-moving missions in order to limit casualties. On top of that, once the bombs were armed, the Star Fortresses were basically tinderboxes ready to go up in flames. Now, the internal bomb bay scenes are really cool. But an internal weapons bay that opens into vacuum but isn't closed off from the main cockpit is a pretty stupid design. But no design is dumber than the proton bombs used in The Last Jedi. These supposedly smart bombs were guided magnetically to their targets, which is just a terrible design choice. Without any type of propulsion after being released, the Star Fortress would need to be extremely close to a target in order to successfully release their payload. So closed as survival is basically impossible if the enemy target has any defensive AA fire. And if the enemy fire doesn't get you, the explosion from those 1,000 bombs you just dropped at close range will. And the reason you have to get really close is there's a good chance that your bombs will miss the target because they're too slow, or worse yet, they might even get attracted to other pieces of metal flying around the space around you, including your fighter escort or your fellow bombers. I really don't understand why they use these things. Although it should be noted that the Star Fortress could also carry probe droids and rocket-propelled munitions, which were a lot more useful. If your ship is way too slow, doesn't have a lot of armor on it, and also doesn't have a lot of defensive weapons, and you really need to get close to your target in order to attack it, what do? Well, you don't get inside the ship. But if I were to give you a real answer, it'd be probably stealth. But unfortunately, the Star Fortress also had an unreasonably large heat signature, which made things kind of difficult on scouting missions. Not really sure why the ship was sent on scouting missions, but it was. On one mission, Rose Tico, while working as an engineer on the Star Fortress Hammer, had to create power baffles to stop the immense energy trace of the Star Fortress from showing up on First Order sector scans. The rebels used to remove the rear turrets from the Y-Wing partly to save weight, but also because they didn't have enough pilots. The Resistance was even smaller than the Rebellion, so why waste crew members on a ship like the Star Fortress? The heavy bomber had a crew of 5, a pilot, 2 gunners, bombardier, and engineer. And that probably still wasn't enough. They probably should have had a co-pilot/navigator, or at least an astromech to work the hyperdrive, along with 2 additional gunner turrets to cover the blind spots in front and below and above the bomber. Still, I would rather take 3 Y-Wings than 1 Star Fortress. At least the Y-Wing has the chance of reaching its target. The Star Fortress was manufactured by Slane and Corbel for the New Republic towards the end of the Galactic Civil War. By the time of the rise of the New Order, the ship was relatively old and primarily being used in a civilian capacity as a freighter, a mining vessel, or for emergency services. The general ineffectiveness of the ship was a result of not only the design, but also the age of the design. Defensive measures and armors that would have been adequate during the Galactic Civil War no longer worked against the First Order. This ship was basically the cheapest way to deliver a massive amount of firepower. What they really should have done with these ships was equip them with long-range guided munitions and then keep them away from the front lines and use them kind of as space artillery. Using them as a main strike force was far too dangerous because the bombers were so slow that it exposed the rest of your fleet and escorts for longer than necessary. Now, if you know anything about World War II aviation, you'll see some resemblance between the Star Fortress SF-17 and another heavy bomber, the B-17 Flying Fortress, a 4-engine long-range bomber by Boeing that carried out many of the air sorties for the Allies over France and Germany. Everything from the name of the ship to the bomb bay doors to their formation to even the gun turrets pay homage to this period of time. While visually it certainly is interesting, the Star Fortress is unfortunately a clear example of why form over function is usually a bad idea. The CR-70 Counselor-class cruiser is one of the first starships we see in Star Wars if we are going by chronological order. In a way, this Republic frigate is like the CR-90 Corvette of the prequel era, built for a similar purpose and used by similar individuals with a similar mission. The first version of the CR-70 Counselor cruiser entered service shortly after the Rusan Reformation, somewhere around 1990 BBY. The leaders of the Republic had quite optimistically promised a future for the galaxy that was without violence, destruction, or chaos. The Counselor-class cruiser was one of the first government ships built during this time and exemplified the spirit of this reformed galactic republic. Used by the government's diplomats, senators, and other important officials, the Counselor-class cruiser was completely unarmed and unable to defend itself from enemy fire. Post-New Sith Wars, the Republic Navy and its Jedi leaders had been completely disbanded, meaning that these cruisers oftentimes had to travel the hyperspace lanes without a federal escort. Occasionally, a local defense force might accompany their mission, but they usually had a very limited and restrictive jurisdiction in which they could operate. Even though the elite lawmakers in the Galactic Center felt like peace was attainable in their time, it was clearly a whole other story on the fringes of the galaxy. The red paint on the Counselor-class cruiser's hull signified the diplomatic immunity an agent of the Republic would have. The same paint would also later be used on Jedi fighters and later on Venator-class Star Destroyers. Now, these Republic agents could signify as much as they wanted on how they were neutral and not to be harmed, but how pirates and corporate overlords reacted to them really depended on the situation. Not having weapons on a ship of this size and importance is completely naive. It also limited a diplomat's options when it came to accomplishing their missions or going through a negotiation. This was not even a normal thing for other civilian ships, which most certainly would have been heavily armed if traversing through the more wild areas of the galaxy. Of course, not every Counselor-class cruiser was used for diplomatic purposes. These ships were officially run by the Judicial Department, who were sort of a federal police, who now were also given additional duties now that the federal military was gone. While the Senate and the Chancellors had their own guard, the Judicials would actually ferry them around in such ships But there were also special Counselor-class cruisers that were also modified for combat duty. This meant that they were oftentimes used as light assault cruisers and also frigates, as well as troop transports. But this wasn't because the Counselor-class cruiser was flexible in its design, it was more a result of the Republic's limited military budget. The Jedi were said to have chosen this ship primarily because of its very utilitarian nature. This means that this ship was clearly designed for civilians and used civilian quality materials. So even if you do install military upgrades to its frame, the Counselor-class cruiser was more a Toyota Helix than, say, an infantry fighting vehicle. Doesn't matter how many Kevlar inserts you put inside the door panels, you probably are not going to survive that battle if it gets too hairy. Even when the ship was converted for military duty, it still lacked the right armament for the job it was required to do. Prior to the Clone Wars, a CR-70 Republic frigate was usually armed with only 4 turbolasers and 2 concussion missile launchers. This was a ship that was 115 meters in length, yet armed like a much smaller gunship. It also lacked point defense weapons, which were usually used to fend off enemy starfighters. These would have been relatively easy upgrades to make to the CR-70. After all, this was a Corellian engineering corporation ship. They usually had a massive aftermarket and also plenty of docking points for bolt-ons. With the start of the Clone Wars, Project Supercharger was started by the Republic's Defense Procurement Office. At the Battle of Geonosis, the Republic military lacked a true escort fleet for its acclimated assault ships and had to rely on just snub fighters and corvettes. The Charger CR-70 retrofit, as it was called, included additional armor and also weapons emplacements. Now you'd imagine a diplomatic cruiser like this, which is unarmed and has a blockade-style engine orientation, would be ridiculously fast. But the CR-70 could travel at only around 900 kilometers in atmosphere. While this might be a bit above average for your typical civilian ship, it was slower than most starfighters and patrol ships, many of which could top out at over 1,200 kilometers per hour. The Charger CR-70 retrofits were installed with larger engines, which did increase the speed substantially, but these were usually not used for diplomatic missions. Even if a Consular-class cruiser was able to make it to hyperspace, its 2.0 class hyperdrive was undersized and underpowered, especially when you consider that many Republic and Rebel Alliance ships had a Class 1.5 or even a Class 1 hyperdrive, as did many larger ships of the line. If your enemy could somehow trace your trajectory once you jumped, they could definitely reach your destination before you could. For a ship of its size, the Counselor-class cruiser had a pretty small crew. This usually was made up of a captain, a pilot, a co-pilot, a navigator, a comms officer, and about 3 or 4 technicians. Counselor-class cruisers were sometimes equipped with as few as 2 crew members, a pilot and a co-pilot. Without a weapons officer or engineer on board, they would be at a serious disadvantage in a major battle. It was said that the crew number was kept low for security reasons. The less crew members you had on, the less people you had to screen in case someone important like Palpatine came aboard. I would argue that most likely this is more due to the Judicial's lacking manpower and funding. While most civilian ships do run skeleton crews in order to save costs, especially long-range haulers, it becomes a huge liability to have such a large ship be so understaffed, especially one that attracts unwanted attention with its paint job. The CR-90 Corvette, which was used during the rise of the Empire and Galactic Civil War period, usually had a minimal crew of 46 and up to 165 depending on the mission. It wasn't significantly larger than the Counselor-class cruiser at 150 meters in length. A skeleton crew usually means that each crew member has more responsibilities, and overall the ship becomes less efficient and less responsive. The Counselor-class cruiser also lacked ample space for its passengers. It could only fit 16 to 24 individuals depending on the configuration of the ship. This was largely due to the fact that the Counselor-class cruiser featured luxurious staterooms with thick walls and insulation for privacy instead of the bunk-style common sleeping areas most military ships had. This again points to the fact that this ship was most likely designed first for civilian use rather than military use. But still, the Republic would use this ship occasionally as a troop transport, making it one of the least efficient transports of its size. Now, the CR-70 was able to function with such a small crew because the majority of its systems were automated or basically maintained by droids. While this was seen as a significant advantage and cost-saving measure, for a ship that could encounter battle, it was a liability. especially because pirates and raiders are more likely to try to stop this ship and then board it and take it over rather than to destroy it. These type of enemies would oftentimes use overpowered ion projectiles, which could take a ship offline for several minutes or hours and not damage or kill anyone inside. This is why most ships feature large engineering departments so that they could quickly repair or replace any damaged components. If the crew is mostly made out of droids, you're going to have a significant problem because they'll all be knocked out by the ion blast. Droids also tend to be unnoticed in Star Wars, meaning it would be relatively easy to sneak aboard a spy or some other malicious actor in the guise of a maintenance droid. Despite the important type of cargo this ship carries around, it had a surprisingly few number of escape pods. Well, there was actually 3, but there were 2 standard ones midship, and then there was a larger salon pod beneath the bridge. The salon pod had multiple purposes. They were heavily armored and sealed from probing and bugging, and were appointed for serious negotiations and diplomacy. The salon pod also served as a common room for the rest of the ship, and in an extreme situation could even be jettisoned off the ship as another escape pod. This large room could hold around a dozen people, but was quite bulky and lacked any real maneuverability or defenses, which meant it was a pretty easy target for an enemy force. Ideally, a ship like the Consort class would have more individual escape pods, making it difficult for the enemy to destroy or seize all of the survivors of the battle. Now, whenever a vehicle or a ship enters combat for the first time, any major design issues will immediately be noticed by either the crew, if they survive, or by the officers in charge of the after-action report. Usually within months, if not weeks, quick fixes and modifications will immediately be implemented, along with a longer list for the manufacturers to implement at the production level. The Consort class cruiser, however, had 2 larger issues that could not easily be altered by some clip-on mods. First, the bridge was located in a precarious location at the head of the ship and slightly jutting out. As a matter of fact, some people might be reminded of an Ithorian's head and neck area. The Ithorians were not known for their fighting ability, they were slow, lethargic, and if I'm being completely honest, they were extremely boring as well. This type of bridge might be useful for a freighter, which requires more visibility when performing complicated docking procedures, but on a combat ship, this was a massive liability. The bridge should be in the most protected area of the ship, ideally somewhere in the middle of the body, and it most certainly should not be placed on a raised platform. Even if an enemy captain has never seen a Corellian ship before, it's pretty obvious where he should attack for the maximum amount of damage. Then there was the large cluster of communication antennas and satellites that sat at the top of the ship right before the engines. The shield generator was also nestled there and relatively unprotected. One direct hit in that area from an enemy turbo laser and the ship would not only lose its communications, it would also lose its shields. Now, if the Consort class cruiser was designed only for the civilian market, I probably would have left it alone. Most Corellian ships are, after all, designed as blank slates that an owner can modify any way they want to. But as a military ship or a transport, the Consort class cruiser needed to be more specialized and better designed for battle. I considered the ship as more of a stopgap measure rather than an actual military ship. It's amazing that the Republic used this cruiser for more than 1,000 years. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.